Late on the morning of the 27th of June, 1957, a 25-year-old Austrian mountain climber named Kurt Demberger was feeling a burn in his lungs that felt like fire. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stop. He plunged his ice axe deep into the hard-packed snow just ahead of him, the metal head biting into the ice with a satisfying thud. He then used the handle of the axe as a lever, pulling his exhausted body up and over a large clump of ice that blocked his path. For just a moment, he leaned forward, resting his weight on the axe, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps in the thin, cold air. He just wanted to stop, maybe for a minute, maybe just for 30 seconds, just long enough to let the fire in his chest die down. But he knew, with a sinking feeling of certainty, that stopping was not an option. Not here. Not now. Kurt and his climbing partner, a 32-year-old man named Herman Buell, were in the middle of attempting something truly extraordinary. They were climbing one of the tallest, most formidable mountains in the world. Its name was Chogalisa, and it towered over the landscape of northern Pakistan, a giant of rock and ice. And the two of them, Kurt and Herman, were climbing it completely alone. It was just the two of them against the mountain. They had virtually no safety equipment to speak of. Now, for anyone who knows anything about high-altitude mountaineering, this was not normal. In fact, it was borderline reckless. Anyone who had ever tried to climb Chogalisa did so with a full support team. They had experienced Sherpas and expert guides. They had ropes and harnesses, and most importantly, they had supplemental oxygen. This was a brutally dangerous climb, and taking serious safety measures was just standard procedure. It was the only way to ensure you had a chance of making it back down alive. But Kurt and Herman, they had a different philosophy. They felt that all of that equipment, all of that support, it took the soul out of mountain climbing. For them, the whole point was the struggle, the purity of man against the mountain. There had to be real, tangible risk for the achievement to feel worthwhile. But there was another, more practical reason for their Spartan approach. Kurt and Herman were keenly aware of the fact that if they managed to successfully climb Chogalisa with no safety equipment, just the two of them, it would be a new world record. Nobody had ever accomplished such a feat on this particular mountain. And the thought of etching their names into the history books of being the first was a powerful motivator. It felt like a truly cool, truly meaningful reason to push themselves to the absolute limit. When they had begun their journey just a few days earlier, setting out from their base camp, it had still felt like a fantastic idea. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and the weather forecast was perfect for the entire duration of their expected climb. The mountains seemed to be inviting them upwards. But earlier that morning, on June 27th, as they were making their final push towards the summit, something had changed. Kurt had turned around to say something to Herman, who was climbing just behind him. And as he did, he noticed something off in the distance, to the south. It was a dark, almost bruised-looking cloud, and it was making its way towards them, moving with an unsettling speed. Now, when you're on the ground, safe, in a city or a town, and you look up and see a dark cloud, you might think, okay, it's probably going to rain. Maybe some snow, maybe a thunderstorm. But unless it's a tornado or a hurricane, a dark cloud isn't usually a cause for major panic. But when you are more than 4 miles up the side of one of the most treacherous mountains in the world, with no one else around for miles and no real safety gear, a dark cloud is a harbinger of potential doom. Storms at that altitude are a completely different animal. They can materialize out of nowhere and with a ferocity that is hard to comprehend. These storms have been killing mountain climbers for as long as people have been trying to climb mountains. So when Kurt and Herman saw this cloud, despite the good forecast they had relied on, they knew they were in trouble. They understood there was a very real chance a severe storm was going to hit them long before they could reach the summit and get back down. They had to make a choice, and they had to make it fast. Their first option was to abort the mission right then and there. They could turn around, head back down to the relative safety of their camp, and maybe give up on the climb altogether. This would mean giving up on the world record. Their second option was to risk it. They could try to speed up, to race the storm to the summit, tag the peak, and then get down before the worst of the weather arrived. And because Kurt and Herman were so tantalizingly close, only about 1,000 feet from the summit when Kurt first spotted that ominous cloud, they decided to risk it. They figured, you know what? We can do this. We can get up there, get this done, and be on our way down before that cloud even reaches us. And so that was the decision they made. It was also why Kurt and Herman knew with absolute certainty that they could not slow down, not even for a single second. It had turned into a desperate sprint to the top. Slowing down might mean dying. So even though Kurt was completely and utterly exhausted from this final frantic push, this is why he knew he couldn't stop. Stopping meant the storm would catch them. Stopping meant they were screwed. Panting, his body aching with the wind now whipping up around them with a furious howl, Kurt and Herman just kept moving, forcing one foot in front of the other, climbing up that mountain as fast as their burning muscles would allow. But when they got to within maybe 500 feet of the summit, they were so incredibly close, something changed dramatically. As Kurt was about to bring his ice axe back down into the snow to pull himself up one more step, he suddenly realized he couldn't see the mountain in front of him anymore. There was nothing. It was just pure, disorienting white all around him. He couldn't see the sky, he couldn't see the ground just a few feet away. It was as if he had been suddenly plunged into a void of white. The reason for this was that the dark cloud had finally caught up to them. They were literally inside of it. The world had disappeared. From behind him, though he couldn't see anything, Kurt could hear Herman desperately screaming his name, his voice muffled by the wind. "We've got to turn around! Right now!" And Kurt knew, with a gut-wrenching finality, that Herman was right. It was too late. They were not going to make the summit. Their gamble had failed. This was now an absolute crisis. If the storm itself, which was now brewing and swirling all around them, didn't kill them, the aftermath certainly would. All the fresh snow that was about to fall would completely fill in their tracks, erasing their path back down the mountain. They would be hopelessly lost, trapped in a whiteout with no way to navigate. They had totally, catastrophically miscalculated. The only thing that mattered now was turning around and getting out of there as fast as humanly possible. And so, that's what Kurt and Herman began to do. As fast as they could, they turned their backs on the summit and began their descent, carefully following the faint footprints they had left on their way up. For a little while, they made serious progress. The tracks were still visible enough, and Kurt was starting to feel a small glimmer of optimism. He thought, maybe we managed to escape this just in time. Maybe we'll be okay. But right at that moment, just as hope was beginning to bloom in his chest, the ground underneath him began to vibrate. It was a low, deep hum that he could feel through the soles of his boots. Then Kurt looked down, and even though his visibility was still terrible, he could see that the snow around his legs was shifting, moving like a liquid. And then, suddenly, Kurt felt that stomach-lurching sensation you get on a carnival ride when it drops you. That weightless feeling in your gut that tells you you're falling. He got that feeling because the ground underneath him had just completely given way. It was an avalanche. In a moment of pure instinctual desperation, Kurt, knowing he was about to be sucked down the mountain, just jumped. He launched himself as far away from the mountain as he possibly could, angling his jump to the right. He was trying to leap up and out of the path of the cascading snow. But you have to remember, he was on an incredibly steep slope. This wasn't like jumping on flat ground where you go up and come back down in roughly the same spot. He was on a near vertical wall of ice and snow. So when he jumped out and to the right, it was like jumping off the edge of a building. He fell, tumbling through the air for what felt like an eternity, but was probably something like 30 or so feet before he slammed back into the ground. When Kurt hit the ground, he fully expected to be immediately gobbled up by the churning snow and dragged down the mountain to his death. But he wasn't. He hit the ground hard, and then he just stopped moving. He sat up, dazed and confused, and looked around. He realized, with a shock of disbelief, that he had successfully jumped out of the avalanche. He had done it. He had saved himself. The visibility was still terrible, but it was starting to improve. The main force of the avalanche had now passed down the mountain, and the storm cloud was beginning to move on. And so Kurt, his heart pounding in his chest, began looking around, screaming out for Herman. He couldn't see him anywhere. And then, as if a curtain was being pulled back, the visibility suddenly cleared. Kurt was able to look to his left, towards the path where the avalanche had just torn through. And as he looked, he saw something that seemed impossible, something his brain struggled to process. The entire section of the mountain where they had been walking, the ridge they had been descending, was just gone. It was as if the avalanche had sheared that part of the mountain clean off. Kurt was now lying in the snow on the very edge of a newly formed cliff, a massive chasm where the avalanche had broken away the mountain. He stared into this crevasse, thinking, "I can't believe how lucky I am." But that thought was immediately followed by another, "I have to go find Herman." And so Kurt scrambled to his feet. He was battered and bruised from the 30-foot fall, but adrenaline was pumping through his veins, numbing the pain. He scrambled his way back up the 30 feet to the ridgeline where he had originally jumped from, hoping that when he got up there, he might find some sign, any sign, of where Herman had gone. They had been so close together when the avalanche started. But when he got to the top, there was no sign of Herman. He turned and looked back down the mountain, scanning the vast white expanse, but he couldn't see him anywhere. But when he turned back around, looking now back up the mountain in the direction they had come from, he noticed that he could see their tracks, his and Herman's, very clearly. And so with his eyes, he just started to trace the path of those footprints all the way down the mountain to where he was now standing. And as he did this, he noticed something. At first, it was like his mind couldn't compute what he was seeing. But after a moment of staring, the horrifying truth crashed down on him. There is a photo that exists that shows what Kurt would have seen. It wasn't a photo Kurt took himself, and it was taken from a slightly different perspective, but conceptually it shows exactly what Kurt saw that told him, with heartbreaking certainty, what had happened to Herman. In the photo, you can see the mountain, with the summit at the top. And there's a trail of footprints that comes straight down. And then, the trail appears to split. One set of tracks veers off to the left, from our perspective, hugging the very edge of that newly formed cliff line. The other set of footprints just continues straight and then disappears off the edge of the cliff. If you haven't figured it out yet, the footprints that go to the left, the ones that miraculously skirted the edge of the abyss, those were Kurt's footprints. By some incredible, impossible stroke of luck, his desperate jump had landed him on the absolute edge of where the avalanche was going to happen. And Herman, he was the other set of prints. And so, when that avalanche started, there was nowhere for Herman to go. He was sucked into that torrent of snow and ice and dragged over 1,000 feet down the mountain. His body was never recovered. In 2014, a 20-year-old man living in India named Maksud Khan had become completely and totally obsessed with tigers. His wife and his family weren't entirely sure what had caused this sudden, all-consuming fixation. They just noticed that after a seemingly random trip he took to the local zoo, he came home and all he could talk about, from morning until night, were tigers. So they figured he must have seen the tigers at the zoo and just become totally enamored with them. But Maksud's obsession wasn't just a simple love and affection for these magnificent animals, although there was certainly an element of that. It was more of a dark, almost reverent fascination with the tiger's savage, untamable nature. There was one story that Maksud used to tell all the time to his friends and family, a story he had either read or heard somewhere. It was about a tiger that was living in captivity. One day, its two trainers had gone into its enclosure, supposedly to put a garland of flowers around its neck for some kind of ceremony or event. But the tiger, for whatever reason, just wasn't having it that day. And when the trainers went to place the flowers over its head, the tiger snapped. It turned on them and killed both of them right there in the cage. Now, Maqsood wasn't telling this story to glorify the violence, or to act like it wasn't a big deal that these two people had died. He told the story with a sense of awe, with a deep reverence for these creatures that he saw as being fundamentally untamable. Even in captivity, he believed, they were still in control. They were wild at their core, and he was just totally fascinated by that idea. In May of that year, 2014, Maqsood lost his job. This was something that, unfortunately, happened to him all the time. He was known among those who knew him as being kind of lazy, a bit of a daydreamer, with a happy-go-lucky attitude that meant he didn't always take things very seriously. He had actually been fired from one job when he was supposed to be unloading heavy sacks from a truck. He had apparently gotten distracted by some small animal, a squirrel or a bird, and had just abandoned his work to run after it. His employer fired him on the spot. But his family depended on him. He had a wife to support, and they told him, "Maqsood, you have to go out and find another job. We need you to work." And so, during the day, Maqsood would leave the house and tell his family that he was going out job hunting. But that's not what he was really doing. He was actually taking the little money his family had, money that was supposed to be for food and rent, and he was going to the zoo. He was going to look at the tigers that he was so in love with. For the next 4 months, from May through September, Maqsood would lie to his family every single day. He would pretend to be looking for work, but instead he would go to the zoo and just stand for hours in front of the tiger exhibit, just staring at them. And so, one day, while he was doing just that, on the 23rd of September 2014, he was looking into the white tiger exhibit at the National Zoological Park in Delhi. Now, the way this exhibit was set up is there was an outer fence, a barrier, that all the zoo visitors had to stand behind. It was an open-air exhibit, so you could see everything clearly. Right on the other side of that fence, there was a little bit of land, a concrete walkway, that protruded into the exhibit for a few feet. And then that walkway would drop straight down about 15 feet into a dry moat. This moat was another layer of protection, designed to keep a safe distance between the tigers and the people. If you continued straight past the moat, the ground would go back up again onto a grassy, tree-filled island in the middle of the enclosure, and that's where the tigers would spend all their time. For some reason that we don't fully understand, although one could guess it was simply because Maqsood wanted to get a better look at the tigers, he decided to climb over that first fence, the one that no visitors are ever allowed to cross. He hoisted himself over the barrier and walked right to the edge of that concrete ledge that sits above the moat. He stood there, looking down at the tigers. Immediately, security guards started yelling at him, telling him to go back, to get back on the other side of the fence where he belonged. All of the other people who were there watching the tigers, the other visitors, they started yelling at him too. They were saying, "Hey, come back. What are you doing? Don't do that!" But Maqsood seemed to ignore them. And at some point, whether he slipped or jumped, we don't know for sure, Maqsood fell 15 feet down into the tiger enclosure, landing in the dry moat. Immediately, a loud alarm started blaring throughout the zoo. This sudden noise woke up the tigers in their habitat. They were startled, they didn't know what was going on, and they started looking around, agitated. The people who were watching this all happen from the safety of behind the fence, they started screaming and yelling. Some of them were trying to get the attention of more security guards, trying to get someone to come and save this guy. It was just absolute chaos. But what was really happening is that all this noise, all this screaming and commotion was totally agitating the tigers, drawing their attention to the source of the disturbance. And very quickly, one of the tigers, a large white tiger named Vijay, noticed that there was now a person, Maqsood, in the moat. The tiger jumped down from its grassy island into the moat and walked right over to Maqsood. And Maqsood was just sitting there, huddled against the concrete wall of the moat, and he was absolutely terrified. People who witnessed it said that he was just praying with his hands pressed together, just frozen in fear. And for a while, the tiger just looked at him. It wasn't showing any immediate signs that it was going to harm Maqsood. It seemed more curious than anything else. But the people who were watching this happen, the crowd on the other side of the fence, they were either busy taking videos and pictures of the event on their phones, or some of them began picking up rocks and small stones and throwing them at the tiger. They were trying, I guess, to get the tiger to leave Maqsood alone, to scare it away. For 10 long minutes, this went on. People were yelling, and a constant stream of rocks was being thrown at this tiger. And the tiger got really, really upset. It became agitated and aggressive. And so, what do you think happens once a tiger gets upset? It attacks. The tiger clamped its powerful jaws down on Maqsood's neck and dragged him out of the moat and over to a grassy, more hidden section within the enclosure. By the time the zoo staff finally showed up with a tranquilizer gun, it was far too late for Maqsood. He was already dead. There is a final picture of Maqsood, taken just moments before the attack. He's seen cowering in the corner of that moat, and the tiger is standing over him, just looking at him. It was a moment of calm before the horrific tragedy. The police would ultimately charge the zoo staff with death by negligence, citing their incredibly long response time and for not having any alternative rescue methods, like a tranquilizer gun, readily available at the enclosure itself. John Jones and his family were avid spelunkers. That's the term for people who love to explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in his native Utah, visiting from Virginia, where he was attending medical school. He was there to celebrate Thanksgiving with his whole family. During his visit, someone in the family suggested they should all go cave exploring, just like they used to in the old days. It would be a great way to reconnect and do something they all loved together. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family members, all got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave. It was a very popular spelunking location in their area, but interestingly, no one in John's family had ever actually explored it before. On the evening of the 24th of November, 2009, at around 8 o'clock at night, John and his brother, along with the rest of their group, entered Nutty Putty Cave. They made their way down into the earth, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. They eventually got to a section of the cave called the Big Slide. It was a fun, relatively easy part of the cave system, and the whole family was having a great time. But it wasn't particularly challenging, and John, even though he hadn't been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he was up for something a bit more difficult. He had this sense of confidence, maybe even a bit of overconfidence. So, he and his brother Josh decided to split off from the main group. They were going to try and find the most challenging section of the entire cave, a notorious passage known as the Birth Canal. So John and Josh said goodbye to the rest of the family and started making their way deeper into the cave towards where they thought the Birth Canal was located. They had a map, and they were trying to follow it as best they could in the dim light. John was leading the way, and at one point he stopped. He had come to a waist-high hole in the cave wall. It was a tight, narrow opening, and for some reason, John became convinced that this was the entrance to the Birth Canal. Now, when John was growing up and used to go cave exploring all the time with his family, he was much smaller. He was just a kid. Now, he was a grown man. He was 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. But in that moment, he still had the mindset of that adventurous, fearless kid he used to be. And so, like a child might do, he saw this hole and, without any real second thoughts, he went for it, diving headfirst into the opening. John began the painstaking process of inching his way down this tunnel. It was incredibly tight, pressing in on his body from all sides. To move forward, he had to wiggle and squirm. His arms were pinned underneath his body, making it even harder to propel himself. And with every tiny movement he made, the passage seemed to get tighter and tighter, but he was still convinced that this was the Birth Canal. He believed that the challenge of this passage was all about pushing past that initial discomfort, about conquering that feeling of claustrophobia. He thought that if you were just brave enough to push past this tight section, you would eventually get to a place where it opened up into a larger cavern. So John, believing this was the right path, kept going, pushing himself farther and farther into this narrow tunnel until he was completely and utterly wedged. He could see that there was still a little bit of tunnel in front of him, and it actually seemed to bend downwards just ahead. and he thought to himself, that's it. That's the opening. I just have to get all the way down there, and I'll be through. He was caught up on a small lip of rock that was digging into his ribs from underneath. And so, in order to get past it, he came up with a plan. He breathed all of the air out of his lungs, making his chest as small as possible, and then he pushed himself forward just past the lip of rock. And then he took a breath in. His chest expanded, and his rib cage was now caught on the other side of that lip. He couldn't move forward, and now he couldn't bring himself back over the lip either. And what was even worse is that as soon as he had gotten over that little lip, he got a better view down into the hole he was trying to get to. And his heart sank. It was a dead end. The tunnel just got narrower and narrower until it came to a point. There was nothing there. This was not the birth canal. It was just some unmarked, unexplored fissure somewhere deep inside the cave. He was trapped, and he knew it. And to make matters even worse, John was positioned almost completely upside down. He yelled up to his brother, his voice echoing eerily in the narrow space, and told him he was stuck. Josh immediately started to try and go down the tunnel after him, but he almost immediately got stuck himself. The passage was just too tight. From where he was, he could barely even see his brother, who was way down at the bottom of this tiny little tunnel. And Josh knew with a dawning sense of horror that if he was getting stuck up here, his brother must be really, really stuck. This was a very, very bad situation. So Josh managed to painstakingly back himself out of the tunnel. He yelled down to John that he was going to go get help, and then he scrambled out of the cave as fast as he could. But it would take 3.5 long hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on the scene. They were deep inside this cave, and it was not an easy place to get to. Susie Matola was the first rescue person to reach John. When she arrived, she called down into the hole. "Hey, John, how are you doing down there?" And Susie would later say that John's voice sounded very distant and strained. He just said, "Hi, Susie. Thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John, telling him that they would have him out in no time, that everything was going to be just fine. But when Susie looked down into that tiny little space that John was wedged in, she thought to herself, this is going to take a really, really long time to get him out. She knew that just setting up a simple pulley system to try and pull him out was going to be a major challenge in such a confined space. And then, the process of actually inching a 6-foot, 200-pound man out of that tiny twisting space, that was going to take hours, maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have days. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to all the parts of your body. When you're inverted, like John was, blood starts to pool in your brain. Your heart simply cannot work fast enough or hard enough to get it out in time, and eventually this causes your organs to shut down. So when the trauma physician who had arrived on the scene saw that John was inverted and learned that he had already been in that position for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescue team that John maybe had 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried absolutely everything they could think of to get John out of that cave. They managed to get a rope around his legs and tried just yanking him out, but it didn't work. He was too tightly wedged. They set up an elaborate pulley system, but the anchors they were trying to secure in the cave walls kept slipping and falling out. It was taking them hours just to get the system set up, only to be able to move him a fraction of an inch before it failed. They brought down drills and chisels, and rescuers squeezed into the tunnel and began trying to physically chisel the rock away from around John's body. But again, the progress was almost negligible, and it was just taking far too much time. As the rescuers were doing everything they could, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming more and more labored. His voice, when he could speak, sounded nasally, which was a bad sign. It indicated that more and more fluid was now building up inside of his lungs. They knew that they were probably within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At one point, they finally managed to get John to move just a couple of inches. They had found a way to keep their elaborate pulley system anchored in the walls. But as he moved, they saw there was a huge, insurmountable problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the sharp angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction to get him out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve his body around the bend in the cave. With John's breathing already so labored, and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, the shock and trauma of that would just send him into cardiac arrest and kill him anyway. And so they came to the heartbreaking realization that they could not get John out of this cave. He was going to die there. 27 hours after John had first become stuck, he became completely unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter. His wife was also pregnant, due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was permanently sealed off with cement. And John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. There is a picture of John taken earlier that fateful night, showing him exploring a different part of Nutty Putty Cave, a smile on his face, before he ultimately made his way over to that fateful tunnel that he went into head first and ultimately died inside of. In 2019, a 21-year-old woman named Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant and driven student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law, working on complex cases that crossed borders. She knew that in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so, during her college years, she had really dedicated herself to learning Spanish and had become quite fluent in a remarkably short amount of time. During her Spanish studies at the university, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jimenez. Daniela very quickly recognized something special in Samantha. She saw that she had this incredible intellect, a powerful work ethic, and this quiet determination that just made it clear she was destined for greatness. In fact, Daniela often compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous and respected international lawyers in the world. And so, just out of a general interest in seeing Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to be a mentor to her. She told Samantha that she was there for her if she ever needed anything, even beyond just help with Spanish. She said she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on her career path, or even if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of someone, she would be available. And Samantha had eagerly taken her up on this generous offer. By 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a strong mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha received the news she had been dreaming of. She got accepted into her top-choice law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so, right after telling her mother and father the good news, Samantha ran straight to Daniela's office to tell her mentor. The two of them hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was a moment of pure joy. It was clear that everything was falling perfectly into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just so incredibly proud of her. A few weeks later, on the night of March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Normally, Samantha spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends. But since she was only about a month away from graduation, and she had already been accepted to law school and really didn't have that much schoolwork left to do, she decided she could finally cut loose for a weekend. So, she and her friends headed out to a downtown area near the university campus called 5 Points. It's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, and on the weekends, it is absolutely packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hopped from one bar to another, laughing and having a great time. And then, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, the group found themselves in a popular bar called the Bird Dog. While they were there, because it was so incredibly crowded, the group of friends accidentally got separated from each other. Now, initially, the friends were all trying to reconnect. They were sending texts and making phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other in the packed bar. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer. And so she sent a text to her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So, Samantha left the Bird Dog Bar all on her own. She called an Uber on her phone and went outside to wait for it. A car pulled up, she hopped in, and the car drove away, back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up the following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room. They tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. They started asking around to their other friends, anyone who might know where she was, but no one did. And so, pretty quickly, Samantha's friends became very, very worried about her. The last they had heard from her, she was leaving a crowded bar all by herself late at night. They were really worried that something bad might have happened to her. And so, by 1:30 in the afternoon that day, that Saturday, the day after they had all gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the exact same time that Samantha was being reported missing, there were two men in their mid-20s who were located about 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in a dense forest, and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, had had no luck at all finding any birds, and they were getting pretty frustrated. And so, by the afternoon, they had decided to split up. They were combing through the forest on their own to see if they would have more luck working solo. And so Ryan, he had posted up next to their truck, which was parked on a quiet dirt road that was right up against the edge of this big forest. Ryan was using his binoculars, scanning out across a large field that bordered the tree line of the forest. He was carefully scanning the edges of the woods, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he had actually walked deep into that forest right next to where Ryan was. And he was just kind of walking around looking for any sign of the birds as well. But he too was still having no luck. And so, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Anders, the one in the forest, was finally ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. He turned around and began walking out of the forest, back in the direction of Ryan and the truck. At this point, he was maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees were very thick and they couldn't really see each other. And so Anders was just kind of walking in that general direction. He wasn't looking for birds anymore, so he wasn't scanning his surroundings. He was just kind of looking straight ahead, wanting to get back to the truck. And as he was walking, something caught his eye off to his left, partially hidden behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked. He couldn't really tell what it was. It definitely wasn't a turkey, but it also wasn't anything that looked like it should be in the middle of the forest. And so he decided he should go get a better look. He turned away from the direction of the truck, went left, and started cutting through the trees towards this object. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by the trees. And when he got a full, clear look at what had caught his attention, he stopped dead in his tracks. He yelled for Ryan, who still couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at what he had found. And as Ryan started running into the forest to see what was going on, Anders was pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally showed up, they found Anders and Ryan, and they were very shaken up. They were sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been waiting. And so the police pulled up to them, they spoke to them, and got directions on how to get to what they had seen inside of the forest. And then the police officers walked into the forest. They followed the directions, and before long, they were looking down at the body of Samantha Josephson. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha had left the Bird Dog Bar and walked out front, where there were lots of other students milling about. She walked to the corner of a road right in front of the bar, and she was looking at her phone, waiting for the Uber she had called. And then a black car pulled up. She hopped inside, and then the car backed up and drove away. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old man named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around the Five Points area all night, presumably trying to trick people, particularly young women leaving bars, into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his horrific plan had worked. He had pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed into the back without question. And then, once she was inside, she couldn't get out again. The back doors of his car were armed with child safety locks. There was no way to open them from the inside. They could only be opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She would have just sat in the back seat, maybe looking at her phone. The car backed up, and it started driving. Except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove in the complete opposite direction. Now, the drive from the Bird Dog Bar to the university campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so, even if Samantha wasn't really paying close attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly that they were going the wrong way. Again, she was expecting to be dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car. We don't know how Samantha reacted when she realized he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized with a surge of terror that it was child-locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was eventually found. And then, once he had parked his car wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife. He then leaped from the front seat into the back seat of his car, where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then, after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die from her injuries. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting normal, everyday posts on his Facebook page. He posted pictures of him smiling in front of his car, and he wrote regular status updates. He was having very normal, casual interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely and totally unaffected by the horrible, brutal crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body, after police used surveillance footage to identify his car. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night that he was going to go out and kill someone. And so he just began prowling around the bars, looking for a victim. And unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. There are final haunting images of Samantha from a security camera showing her as she climbs into Nathaniel's car, a car she believed was taking her home safely. On the evening of the 29th of December 1986, a California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre drove his cruiser down Interstate 15 inches, San Diego, California. With him, riding in the back seat, was an NBC News reporter. And in the passenger seat, there was a cameraman. They were in the middle of filming a news segment about highway travel safety, and it was set to air on the local evening news later that very night. Officer Pyre was following his typical patrol route, but after a few minutes, they passed by a large green sign that said Mercy Road. It was an exit ramp. And at that point, Officer Pyre turned to the news team, pointed at the Mercy Road sign, and said that's where they found the body. A little more than 36 hours earlier, at around 4 o'clock in the morning on December 27th, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a creek bed right near the bottom of that Mercy Road exit. Kara had been on her way home from her boyfriend's house when, for whatever reason, maybe she was having car trouble, or maybe she had pulled over to try and help someone, she wound up in that dead-end cul-de-sac at the bottom of the ramp. And while she was there, she clearly encountered someone incredibly dangerous, someone who took her life. And so this was actually why the California Highway Patrol and NBC News were collaborating on this news segment. Kara's killer was still out there, and the community was on edge. And so the idea behind this segment was basically to tell drivers who use this highway how to stay safe, especially if, for whatever reason, they had to stop their car somewhere along the highway. They wanted to show people what to do in that kind of situation. And so, as Officer Pyre passed by the Mercy Road exit and continued down Interstate 15, he turned to the news crew and, as they filmed, he began talking about the basics of highway travel safety. Specifically, he said, look, one of the most hazardous things that can happen to you, beyond just having an accident on the highway, is if you have some sort of car trouble that forces you to stop on the side of the road. Because once you stop, there's an inclination for a lot of people to want to get out and leave their vehicle. But that is a very dangerous thing to do. Officer Pyre also specifically warned people not to get into a stranger's car because there was a running theory at this point in the investigation that perhaps Kara had gotten into her killer's car willingly. As this particular segment was being filmed, the one you just watched, Officer Pyre was looking ahead down the highway, and he noticed there was a car pulled over on the shoulder of the road with its hazard lights blinking. So he turned to the news crew and basically said, look, here's a perfect chance for us to actually show the people at home in real time what to do in case your car breaks down on the highway. So he pulled his police cruiser over right behind the stalled car. He got out, and then he gestured for the news crew to come with him. Officer Pyre walked over to the passenger side door of this car, and through the open window, he asked the driver to please get out and talk to him. The driver did as he was asked, and as the camera rolled, Officer Pyre asked him to explain what was going on, what had happened to his car. The driver said that he had run out of gas and had gotten stranded on the side of the road. He said he had then left his car and walked to a gas station to get a gas can, came all the way back, and put the gas into his car. But his car still wouldn't start. Now, at this point, Officer Pyre is realizing that this driver is doing basically exactly what he shouldn't be doing, according to the safety tips that Officer Pyre himself had just been giving on camera. And so on camera, he basically says to this guy, do you understand how dangerous it is to have left your car like that and walked all alone on this highway? Do you understand what a hazard that is? And the driver just kind of looked at him and shrugged like, yeah, I guess so. After that, Officer Pyre called the man a tow truck. His car was towed away, the man was on his way, and Officer Pyre got back into his cruiser with the news crew, and they carried on with their patrol. After that, Officer Pyre and the news crew wrapped up their filming for the day. And after he dropped them back off at the news station, they told him what time to expect his segment to air on NBC that night. And sure enough, that evening, Officer Pyre was at home in front of his TV as the broadcast started. And when Officer Pyre's actual segment aired on TV to him and to the California Highway Patrol, it went great. It was about 1.5 minutes long. It sort of hit all the high points. It showed Officer Pyre looking professional and authoritative, talking about how to be safe on the highway and helping that stranded motorist. It did exactly what they had expected it to do. And when it was over, Officer Pyre clicked off the TV and probably didn't think much more about it. It was not a big deal. It was just a basic police safety video. And for the vast majority of other people who watched this clip live on TV that night, it really didn't stand out to them either. Again, it was just a kind of routine police safety segment. But there were a few people when they watched this clip that noticed something very specific. And within an hour of this clip airing on TV, those few people were calling the police department in droves, all of them telling the police the same thing. We know what happened to Kara Knott. And the police would follow up on these incredible tips. And sure enough, just over 2 weeks later, they had gathered enough evidence that they were able to arrest Kara Knott's killer. It would turn out that all the clues the police needed to solve the Kara Knott murder case were right there in that 1.5 minute long video. Because what had happened to Kara had almost happened to over 24 other young women in the San Diego area. And those young women, those survivors, were the ones who saw the news segment when it aired live. And they noticed a particular detail that clearly telegraphed who Kara's killer was. They were the ones who called the police. On the night of Kara's murder, the 27th of December, 1986, she had pulled off of Interstate 15 at the Mercy Road exit, and she had come to a stop in that dark cul-de-sac. Now, we don't know exactly why she came to a stop there, but either way, she was there. And that's where she encountered her killer. Now, the other 24 women who had encountered this same person, the killer, they were terrorized and in some cases tortured and held hostage for a couple of hours, but they were eventually let go. But Kara wasn't. During her encounter, at some point, the killer had clubbed her over the head and then strangled her to death with a piece of rope. Now, the killer, at first, had gotten away with this murder until he was featured on that 1.5 minute long safety video. And some of those women, the ones who had survived their attacks, they were at home watching the evening news, and suddenly their attacker was on TV. Now, they had previously reported their attacks to the police, but up to this point, nothing had really come of it. And now, They are staring, in disbelief, at the face of the man who had attacked them, and he's right there on their TV screen. And critically, as part of this news segment, they're hearing the reporter talk about how this other young woman, Kara Knott, had been attacked and killed on this very same highway. And they're thinking to themselves, oh my God, this person did that to me. I barely got away. I bet they're the one who killed this girl. And on top of all of that, as they're watching the news, staring at their attacker, they can see that he has a fresh, long scratch or cut over his eye. And so you put all of that together, and they thought, boom, that is the person who killed Kara Knott. And sure enough, the police would follow up on these tips, and they would confirm that the man in the video, the police officer with the cut over his eyebrow, was Kara's killer. And Kara's killer was none other than Officer Craig Pyre. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Since being incarcerated, he has gone up for parole 2 separate times and has been rejected both times. However, he is up for parole again in 2027. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the night of the 25th of August 2011, a 23-year-old woman named Risa Dura and her husband, Hioki Dura, were sitting together on their couch. They were in their apartment in Kanazawa City, Japan, and they were just watching some TV. And as they sat there, they were both laughing hysterically at what was on the screen. It was their absolute favorite show, a hidden camera comedy prank show. For them, this was the perfect way to end the day, just sitting here together on the couch, laughing their heads off. Risa and Hioki had only been married for 4 months. They were still deep in that newlywed bliss period where they spent basically every possible second they could with each other. When Hioki wasn't at work, the two of them were always out and about. They'd go out to eat at their favorite restaurants, they'd go to the movies, or they'd take little day trips to the beach, since Kanazawa City was right there on the coast. And whenever they were out, they were constantly talking about how lucky they felt. They truly believed they had found their perfect match in each other. They were married, and this was what the rest of their lives was going to look like. Just being together, happy. They felt like the luckiest people in the world. Risa and Hioki had actually known each other for a long time. They first met when they were just kids in middle school. But back then, Hioki was extremely shy. He was so quiet that he really didn't speak to Risa at all. He had a crush on her, but he never let it show. So, nothing ever came of it. But then, years later, after they had both finished college and were starting their adult lives, they just happened to run into each other again. And this time, Hioki, who was still a bit shy but had grown more confident, decided he had to tell Risa the truth. He confessed to her that he had always loved her all the way back in middle school, and that he still did. Risa was totally shocked by this. She had always kind of felt something for him too, but because he was so quiet, it just never seemed like he was interested in her at all. So to her, this was this incredible revelation, but it was more than just a surprise. It was incredibly romantic. It felt like something out of a classic Hollywood love story. This quiet boy she knew from her childhood had been harboring this secret love for her all these years. And so, when he finally confessed his feelings, she pretty much immediately said yes to a date. She was so excited, and from that very first date, it was just a total whirlwind. They fell completely and totally in love, and within a year, they were married. They ended up settling in Kanazawa City mostly because of Hioki's job. He worked for a company that was based in the city, and he was doing really well there. He was considered a rising star. Every time Risa would meet one of his coworkers, they would rave about him. They'd say what a hard worker he was, what a natural-born leader he was becoming. Risa was so proud of him. But more than that, she felt inspired by his drive and his passion for his work. It made her want to find a really fulfilling job for herself, something she could be just as passionate about. So, she was actively on the hunt for her own career. But for the moment, Risa was still in that phase of trying to figure out exactly what she wanted to do. She had so many interests and was always jumping from one thing to another. She had this huge, insatiable curiosity about the world, and she absolutely loved trying new things. This was a wonderful quality, but it also made it really hard for her to choose just one single path for her life. But Hioki was incredibly supportive through all of it. He treated Risa like she was royalty. He always told her that whatever she wanted to do was completely fine by him as long as it made her happy. He just wanted to see her smile. So for now, as Risa sat on the couch next to Hioki, laughing at this funny show, her mind started to wander. It drifted away from the television and away from her ongoing job search and landed on Hioki's birthday. It was coming up very soon, and she felt this immense pressure to do something really, really special for him. A big part of that pressure came from the fact that Hioki always did something incredibly thoughtful and amazing for her. For her birthday, for any special occasion, he really knew how to celebrate her and make her feel loved. She didn't want to underwhelm him with her gift. Plus, this was going to be the first time either of them had a birthday now that they were officially married. So Risa wanted to go all out. She wanted to plan something that Hioki would never, ever forget. But as she sat there on the couch trying to brainstorm the perfect birthday celebration, she just kept drawing a blank. It felt like the only thing she could really focus on that they shared was their romantic nature. They were both very romantic people. So whatever she did, it had to be romantic in some way. But how? She wasn't sure. In many ways, she and her husband were very different in how they expressed their affection. Hioki was still that quiet, reserved person he'd always been. His displays of affection were usually very reserved and private just for her. But Risa, on the other hand, was a massive extrovert. She was full of energy, and so her displays of affection were often over the top, big, and boisterous. So Risa was really struggling, trying to think of how she could combine their two styles of romance into one perfect celebration. And then, all of a sudden, it was like she had an epiphany. She saw it perfectly in her mind's eye. The perfect way to celebrate his birthday. She didn't even know what had inspired it, it just came to her in a flash. She would take her husband out for a very romantic walk on the beach at night. But then, at the end of the walk, there would be this huge surprise. An over-the-top fireworks display just for him. It was the perfect idea. It was romantic, and it was a little crazy, just like her. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, Risa and 6 of her friends were at Osaki Beach. This was the beach where the big birthday surprise was going to happen that very night. Risa had spent the previous day, while Hioki was at work, planning out all the details of the party. But now, on the day of, there was some actual physical setup that needed to be done. This wasn't just going to be a walk on the beach with some fireworks. There was another element to her plan, a secret prank element, and she needed her friends' help for that. So, on this afternoon, they were walking along the beach looking for the perfect spot. The spot needed to do 2 things. First, it had to afford Risa and her husband some privacy, so it would feel very romantic and intimate. But it also needed to have a good vantage point for her friends, a place where they could hide and watch the couple. They needed to be able to see Risa's signal so they would know exactly when to light the fireworks. And so Risa and her friends are walking along the sand, scanning the coastline, and then they see it. There was this private, sort of secluded section of the beach that had a long row of thick shrubbery lining the back of it. It was perfect. The bushes would be a perfect hiding spot for her friends. And the beach itself, down on the sand, was nice and private and peaceful. They all agreed this was the best spot for the big party. So, they got to work. Her friends went up into the bushes and started getting their fireworks ready, figuring out the best way to set them up for a quick launch. Meanwhile, Risa went down to the sandy part of the beach and she prepped the area where she and Hioki would be standing. The final touch was laying out a big blue sheet on the sand. This would be their mark, the spot where they needed to be for the surprise to work perfectly. Once the blue sheet was in place, she walked back up to her friends in the bushes. They all confirmed that everything was ready to go. Risa told her friends the plan was to be back there that night at exactly 10 p.m. with her husband. She told them they should probably get there a little bit earlier, just to make sure they were all set up and hidden. They all agreed, and then they packed up and left the beach. As Risa left the beach that afternoon, she found herself feeling incredibly antsy. She was just so excited about this big surprise party she had planned for that night. She just wanted it to be 10 p.m. already so she could finally reveal everything she had in store for Hioki. But she also knew she had to play it cool. She couldn't give away any hint that she had this big surprise planned. So, when she got back home where Hioki was waiting, she acted like everything was totally normal. When she walked inside, she told Hioki to just go relax on the couch while she made them both a very nice dinner. She wanted to pamper him a little bit. When dinner was ready, the two of them sat down at the table. Risa pretended like she had absolutely nothing planned for his birthday weekend. She casually asked him, "Hey, what should we do this weekend to celebrate your birthday?" They talked about maybe going to see some friends or going out to a movie, just brainstorming ideas. But of course, it was all a big act. Risa knew exactly what they were doing that night. Later, when it was getting kind of late and it seemed like Hioki was maybe thinking about heading to bed, Risa made her move. She said, "Wait a minute. It's your birthday weekend. Let's not go to bed just yet. Let's go for a walk on the beach." What a great romantic idea that would be. Hioki was a little surprised by the suggestion, it being so late, but he thought about it for a second and then said, "Actually, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go for it." As soon as he said yes, Risa could barely contain her excitement. She knew she had this amazing, incredible thing planned for him down at the beach, and it was about to happen. This was going to be awesome. And so, she and her husband quickly cleaned up the dinner dishes. And then, just before 10 p.m., they left their apartment, got in their car, and started heading to the beach. About 10 minutes later, they parked at the end of a dead-end road right near the beach. When they got out of the car, they were surrounded by bushes on all sides of the road. But there was a little sandy path that cut through the bushes and led down to the open beach. As Risa led Hioki down this path and onto the sand, she quickly realized she had a very big problem. There was virtually no moonlight. The sky was overcast, and it was basically pitch black out on the beach. This was a huge issue. Remember, she had put out that blue blanket to mark the exact spot where she and Hioki needed to be. It was their position marker, so that her friends, who were hidden nearby in the bushes, would know when and where to light off the fireworks. The entire plan, the entire surprise, was contingent on them getting to that blue blanket. And it was so dark that not only was Risa unable to see the blue blanket from a distance, she could barely even see the sand right in front of her feet. It was so dark, it was almost eerie out there. And you have to remember, this was in 2011. You couldn't just pull out your cell phone and turn on a powerful flashlight. That feature didn't really exist yet. So the best they could do was to pull out their phones, tap on the screen to wake them up, and use the little bit of light coming from the home screen to try and guide their way. After walking on the beach for just a short ways, Hioki actually stopped Risa. He said, "Hey, I don't think it's safe to be walking on the beach right now. We really can't see where we're going at all. Let's go back to the car and see if we have a flashlight." But Risa knew her friends were already in position. They were waiting in those shrubs down the beach, ready to light off those fireworks. And she figured they probably couldn't see very well either. She started to worry that if she and Hioki didn't get to the spot soon, her friends might panic. Maybe they'd think something was wrong, or maybe they'd light off the fireworks prematurely. She didn't know what might happen, but she was starting to get worried that her whole perfect plan was falling apart. She couldn't afford to be late. And so she told her husband, "No, let's not go back for flashlights. Let's just keep walking. It's no big deal. The sand is flat." And so the two of them continued walking along the beach, holding up their dimly lit cell phone screens to try and guide them. But pretty quickly, Hioki started to notice that Risa seemed really anxious, and she was walking way too fast. This was supposed to be a peaceful, romantic walk on the beach, but Risa was walking like a woman on a mission. She was striding ahead of him, clearly trying to get somewhere specific. but he didn't understand where she was trying to go. Finally, he called out to her and said, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you walking so quickly? What are we doing out here?" And so finally, she just stopped. She turned and looked at her husband, and she was about to tell him what was actually going on. She felt like the surprise was ruined at this point anyway, and she basically needed his help if they were ever going to find this blanket and figure out where they needed to be. But right as Risa opened her mouth to tell her husband what was going on, suddenly, it was like the whole world went completely black. There was no more ambient light from their cell phones, no more minimal moonlight, nothing. Just absolute blackness and then a sudden, jarring silence. At that exact same time, Risa's friends were not that far away, hiding up in the bushes just like they had planned. But, much like Risa and Hioki, they had also been dealing with the problem of not being able to see anything. It was so incredibly dark. They had gotten into position, but they couldn't even see the sand clearly from where they were hiding. They had absolutely no idea if Risa and Hioki were in position or not. But they could hear them. They could hear the faint sound of Risa and Hioki talking, somewhere out there on the sand in the darkness. The friends were whispering back and forth to each other in the bushes. How are we going to know when they're actually in position? How are we going to get the signal to light off the fireworks? We can't see them at all, and so the friends were feeling really unsure about what to do. They were straining their eyes, peering out onto the dark sand, trying to see Risa, trying to see Hioki. But again, they couldn't see them. They couldn't even see the blue blanket that they knew wasn't that far away. And so they were just looking and listening, and they could kind of tell that the voices they were hearing were probably Risa and Hioki. And it sounded like they were moving in their general direction. But then, suddenly, they heard screams. The screams were coming from the same direction as the voices they believed were their friends. At first, for just a split second, they thought the screams might actually be the signal. Like a loud, crazy signal to light off the fireworks. But the screams didn't sound happy. They sounded like somebody was in serious trouble. And critically, as soon as the screaming started, it abruptly stopped. It was just a couple of high-pitched, awful screams, and then total silence. Absolute, total silence on the beach. And again, they couldn't see anything. So, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't even know for sure if that was Risa and Hioki, but they had a terrible feeling that something was wrong. So they abandoned the fireworks plan completely. They left their hiding spot in the bushes and they charged out onto the beach. They were looking all around, shouting their friends' names, but they still really couldn't see anything. They couldn't even find the blue blanket, and they knew roughly where it was supposed to be. And so they're running around the beach in the dark. They're calling out for Hioki and Risa, but they're not hearing anything back. For a full 30 minutes, they were just running around in a panic, looking for their friends, just knowing in their gut that something bad had just happened. And then, at some point, one of the friends doubled back. They went roughly to the area where they knew the blue blanket was supposed to be. And that's when they made a discovery. It would turn out that when Risa and Hioki were out on that beach, walking around in the total darkness, Risa actually did find the blue sheet that she had set up. Except it was so dark that even though they were, at one point, literally standing on the blanket, she and Hioki couldn't even tell it was that dark. Now, that might not seem like it would be catastrophic until you consider what was underneath that blanket. So, 2 days earlier, when Risa had her big epiphany about how to create the best birthday ever for Hioki, she had been inspired in part by the show they were watching on TV. That hidden camera comedy show that she and Hioki both loved. The show was called Arashi's Big Secret, and its comedy really came from the over-the-top pranks that the show's hosts would pull on Japanese celebrities. And one of those pranks, a recurring one, was to dig a large hole on the beach, cover it up, and then trick somebody into accidentally falling into it. And so Risa thought, what a great idea. What if I dig a hole on the beach, cover it up, and then after our romantic walk, I'll have Hioki fall into the hole as a funny prank. And then my friends will immediately fire off those fireworks. It'll be like he's on the game show that we love so much. It was supposed to be a perfect combination of a romantic, fun time on the beach, a harmless prank, and then a big birthday celebration afterwards. It was, in her mind, the perfect plan. However, Risa had made a terrible, fatal miscalculation. On the game show, when they would dig these holes in the beach, they would cover them with a very specific material. It was basically dried foam, almost like styrofoam. The instant one of their contestants or celebrities stepped directly on the foam, it would immediately break and they would fall safely, feet first, into the hole. But what Risa did was different. After she and her friends dug this deep hole, getting ready for the big party, she covered it first with a thick, rigid piece of plastic. It was almost like a thin sheet of plywood, but made of hard plastic. So she covered the hole with that, and that was the platform. And then she covered that platform with the blue sheet so that to the naked eye, it just looked like the ground was level underneath. In Risa's mind, this rigid piece of plastic would break the instant her husband stepped on it. She thought it wasn't that strong. Maybe it was strong enough to hold him for a second, but it would definitely snap in the middle and he would fall in, just like on the show. But in reality, when she and her husband inadvertently walked onto that blue sheet without even realizing it because it was so dark, that piece of plastic didn't break. It was too rigid. Instead of breaking, the plastic just suddenly tilted to one side. It acted like a trapdoor. This caused both Risa and her husband to suddenly tumble forward, both of them headfirst into this deep hole. And as they fell, their weight on the edge of the hole caused a massive avalanche of sand to pour in from all sides, completely covering the two of them up. And so Risa and Hioki, they screamed for just a second as they began to fall into the ground. And then suddenly, they were upside down and completely buried all the way to the top by heavy, wet sand. That's why it went silent after the screams. It was because they were completely buried alive. Risa's friends, after searching the beach after hearing those screams, they would eventually find the blue blanket. It was partially submerged in the sand. They really didn't know what had happened, but because of the screams and what they were now seeing, they just immediately called the authorities. When the emergency crews came out to the beach, it would take them nearly 30 minutes to finally dig Risa and Hioki out from that hole. But by that point, it was far too late. They had both suffocated to death. One morning, in the winter of 1856, a 27-year-old explorer named Dr. Edward Fogel sat down for breakfast. He was at the home where he was staying in the city of Abashir, which was in a kingdom called Wadai in Central Africa. Edward poured himself a cup of milk, and then, even though the table in front of him was full of warm breads and cakes and porridge, Edward called a servant over. He asked her to please get him a plate of boiled eggs. But the servant just apologized and explained, "I'm very sorry, but we don't have any eggs this morning. We are all out." Edward was disappointed, but he just thanked the servant anyway, and she left. Edward was visiting Africa from his home country of Germany. He was on a map-making expedition, and he'd been staying in Abashir for the past 2 weeks. So far, all the local food he had tried really upset his stomach. Everything except for eggs. So, for literally every single meal since he had arrived, the only thing he would eat was eggs. And now, because they were out of eggs, despite there being all this other perfectly good food to choose from, he knew he couldn't eat it without getting sick. And so, he would just have to go hungry. But outside of the food issue, overall, Edward thought the city of Abashir was okay. He had been given the chance to meet the king, who had then arranged for him to stay in this very nice home that was owned by a local noble family. And the area itself was extremely beautiful. Edward was on track to be the very first European to successfully make a detailed map of it, which meant that he would essentially be creating history. But Edward just really was not getting along with the local people. They seemed to him to be kind of suspicious of him for no reason, and Edward couldn't believe it. They didn't seem to care at all that he was this famous map maker who had come all the way there from Germany to literally put their, what he considered to be, insignificant city onto the map of the whole world. Why didn't they appreciate that? He just couldn't understand it. And now, adding insult to injury, Edward couldn't even eat any breakfast. And so, feeling pretty annoyed, despite all the effort the family had clearly made to feed him that morning, Edward stood up from the table and he left to go spend the day exploring. He walked out into the front courtyard of the home, where another servant was waiting with Edward's horse. Edward spent most of his days in the city just kind of riding around and drawing maps of the streets and the alleyways. But today, this servant warned Edward that he really ought to stay inside. The servant told him it was not safe for him to go out into the city today. At this point in time, the kingdom that Abashir was a part of was at war with several neighboring nations. And so, as a result, everybody in the city was very worried about spies. This meant they were extremely suspicious of any foreigners, like Edward. Now, for the most part, the locals had sort of put up with his presence so far, but to them, it just seemed like he was always watching them, always writing in his notebook, but never talking to anyone. And so they had started to gossip about him. But Edward, after being given this warning by the servant, did not take it seriously at all. Instead, he kind of scoffed and said, it's no big deal. I'm not going to be out there for very long anyways. Nothing's going to happen. He then told the servant that he had another plan for the day. His big plan was to leave the city of Abashir and go to this nearby mountain. He wanted to climb up the mountain and get a bird's-eye view of the entire city from the top to help him finish his map. But when Edward said that, the servant looked truly horrified. He told Edward that he simply could not do that because the mountain Edward was clearly talking about was sacred. Nobody was allowed to climb it. It was a very important rule to the people who lived there. But to Edward, this warning didn't land at all. Instead, he just saw it as more evidence that the locals just didn't appreciate what he was doing for them. He was on a very important mission, a mission that was, in his mind, far more important than anything that was sacred to them. And so Edward, he thanked the servant for the warning, but also basically said, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because this is really important. And so he said, I'm going to go hike that mountain and I'll see you tonight when I drop off the horse. And then Edward climbed onto the horse and he rode off. But Edward didn't come back. He didn't come back that night, or the day after, or the day after that. And pretty soon, it became very clear that Edward Fogel was missing. Word of Edward's disappearance ultimately made it back to Germany pretty quickly, specifically to the Geography Society that had sent him to Africa on this map-making mission in the first place. So the Geography Society and the German public were very concerned, and they sent several search parties to Africa to go look for Edward. But despite multiple serious attempts over several years, nobody ever found him or figured out what happened to him. And because of this, Edward sort of became famous back in Germany. People began to see him as this brave explorer who thirsted for knowledge and went daringly into the unknown. They imagined all sorts of dramatic and tragic things that might have happened to him. Maybe he had been assassinated by a rival kingdom or taken prisoner. Or maybe he discovered something holy or ancient that he wasn't supposed to see. And so, in time, the story of Edward Fogel got bigger and bigger. He became like a symbol of German pride. This was our great explorer. He had done something amazing, clearly. Also adding intrigue to this already very bizarre mystery was the fact that all of the people who actually went to Africa to look for Edward, all the members of those search parties over the years, literally every single one of them died. Now, we know how those searchers died. It was due to local violence or disease or just plain bad luck. But it sort of added to the intrigue of this mystery. The idea that everybody who went looking for Edward didn't come back, that became part of the lore. And so this mystery just continued to grow and grow. It was passed around and things were embellished and things were fictionalized until finally, almost 20 years after Edward disappeared, another explorer named Gustav Nachtigall decided that he was going to be the one who finally figured out, once and for all, what actually happened to this guy. And so, in the early winter of 1874, Gustav is now in the courtyard outside of his apartment in Abashir. He had actually traveled to Africa to begin his search for the answer. What happened to Edward? And he's standing in this courtyard along with his translator, whose name was Ahmed. The two of them were sitting across from an elderly man who was friends with the current king of Abashir. This elderly man had, at one point, lived in one of the apartments across this very courtyard. And so Gustav asked this old man if he had ever met with a European man about 17 years earlier. And Ahmed translated the question for him. And the old man said, yes, he had. He remembered that one European man had come to meet with the king around that time. He said the man had always been writing in this notebook, but he had never seemed to want to speak to anybody and had, for the most part, just kept to himself. But the old man said that, beyond his general impression of the guy, he really didn't know anything about him. He had no idea what he was doing there or what ultimately happened to him. So at this point, both Gustav and Ahmed had been in Abashir for 2 months. And in that time, they had been trying to ask around and see if anybody remembered Edward. And so far, they had run into a few people who did seem to remember him, like this older man, because it was pretty rare to see a European person in the city. But unfortunately, nobody had any specific information on how or when Edward had disappeared. Or, in the rare case that they did seem to know more, they refused to talk about it. And so for Gustav, on the one hand, this was incredibly frustrating. All he wanted was the truth. But on the other hand, as he ran into more and more people who seemed apprehensive to even talk about Edward at all, that sort of suggested that maybe something really bad did happen to Edward when he was in Abashir. And if that was the case, if some horrible fate befell him, Gustav knew there was one person in this city who almost certainly would know the truth. But Gustav basically couldn't ask this one person any questions about Edward without being incredibly offensive. Because this one person was the current king of Abashir, King Ali. And it would have been his father who had met Edward and arranged for him to stay with that noble family when he was doing his map-making. And so, for Edward to have been killed or captured, or if something horrible had happened to him while he was in Abashir, well, King Ali's father would have had to have given the okay. Or he would have at least known about it and been okay with it. He would have known something, making him complicit in whatever happened to Edward. And so to ask King Ali, hey, what do you think happened to Edward? You could be potentially suggesting that his own father did something terrible. But it was more than that. What Ahmed had told Gustav was that you don't just risk offending the king by asking those questions. You might actually be executed for offending the king. And so, what Gustav decided he needed to do, because he was so dead set on trying to solve this mystery, is he still needed to find a way to talk to King Ali about Edward, but without losing his life. He had to come up with a very clever way to get this information out of the king. A few weeks later, Gustav and Ahmed had still not yet come up with a clever way to speak to the king. They couldn't figure out a way to approach the subject without horribly offending him. And so the two of them were in Gustav's apartment eating lunch when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Gustav got up, he went to the door, and when he opened it up, it was a courier. The man told Gustav that he was part of a caravan that had just arrived there from North Africa, and he had some mail for Gustav from back home. He had letters from Germany. He just handed the whole bundle of mail to Gustav. And Gustav, who did not get mail very often, was very excited. He said, "Oh, thank you." He took the mail, thanked the guy again, shut the door, and went back into the common room. And he just began going through the mail, looking to see who had sent him something. And as he was doing it, he suddenly had this great idea. It had nothing to do with what was actually written in the letters. It was just the concept of receiving mail that suddenly gave him this brilliant way to talk to the king. The very next day, Gustav and Ahmed walked into the royal palace in Abashir. When they walked in, they eventually made their way into this bright and airy courtroom. And in this courtroom, on the other end, against the far wall, was King Ali sitting on his throne. So Gustav and Ahmed immediately went over to the king, and they greeted him and they exchanged some pleasantries. And as they were doing that, Gustav, he knew that that same caravan that had come through the day before with his mail had also made a stop at the palace. He knew they had presented the king with all these lavish gifts like a silver tea set and gold watches and all this luxurious fabric. And so Gustav was really hoping that those gifts had put the king in a really good mood, because that was a big part of his plan. At some point, after the pleasantries had stopped, Gustav actually referenced the caravan. He told the king that, in fact, they had also swung by his place and dropped off this big bundle of letters from back home. And he said he was really happy about it. And the king kind of seconded that and said, "Oh yeah, they gave me all these great gifts." Yes, it was so wonderful. And so they're kind of talking back and forth about how great this mail delivery was when Gustav tells this incredible lie to the king. He tells the king, he goes, all those letters, it was really great to hear from home, from my friends, from my family. But there was this one really weird letter in there that I didn't even know who it was from. Now, this letter didn't exist. This was a total fabrication. But he told the king that this weird letter, it was from an elderly man who had written to Gustav to tell him that his son had gone to Abashir many years ago and had never come home again. And so now, this elderly man, he knew his son was probably not alive at this point, but in this fictional letter to Gustav, he told Gustav that his son had done a lot of writing in notebooks. And he was hopeful that maybe someone in Abashir still had these notebooks. And could Gustav please get the notebooks and return them to the old man, just to give him some comfort about what his son had been doing and saying and thinking before he disappeared. As soon as Gustav said this, he could actually feel the mood in the throne room shift. He could tell that King Ali was very much on edge about what Gustav might say next. But Gustav had planned for this. And he told the king that, just so you know, all throughout Europe, people think of you as a wise and just king. And so, if by chance you have these notebooks and you were to give them to me so I can give them to this elderly man in his old age so he can have some comfort before he dies, if you would do that, the people of Europe would love you even more for that simple act of kindness. Then Gustav went quiet, and there was this really intense silence in the throne room. But then the king just kind of sat back in his throne and he smiled at Gustav. And as soon as Gustav saw that smile on the king's face, he decided he just had to do it. And he said to the king, "The son's name is Dr. Edward Fogel." And then after that, Gustav just went silent. Because he knew at this point, if the king thought he was lying or trying to trick him, he could easily be executed right here, right now. But King Ali just kept on smiling at Gustav and just said, "You know what? I will think about it." Gustav quickly thanked the king and hurried out of the throne room. And then he went back to his apartment and spent the entire night just pacing around his room, wondering what was going to happen. Part of Gustav was optimistic that maybe the king would come through here and hand over these notebooks if he really did have them. But the other part of Gustav, the more realistic side, thought that maybe what he had just done was effectively sign his own death warrant. And that soon he'd become one of the many travelers who came to Abashir and never went home. A few days later, a very nervous Gustav followed a palace guard back into the throne room. And when he got in there, he immediately saw King Ali sitting on his throne. And Gustav really couldn't read his expression. So he didn't know if the king was mad at him, if he was going to be conciliatory, if he was going to help him. He had no idea. And so Gustav just walked into the room and kind of held his breath. King Ali broke the silence. And when he did, it was clear he was not angry. He was just kind of even-keeled. And he told Gustav that after their conversation, he had gone and spoken to the noble family that Edward had stayed with when he was here. But they told him they couldn't find any of Dr. Edward's writings. They said the notebooks had either been thrown away or lost. And so, unfortunately, there was nothing to send back to Edward's elderly father. Now, Gustav did not believe this for a second. At this time, paper was very scarce. There was no way they would have been just throwing it away or destroying it. Paper was pretty valuable. But he couldn't say that to the king. So he just swallowed his disappointment and thanked the king for asking about the notebooks. And then Gustav hoped that at this point he'd be allowed to leave. But one of the guards put their hand on Gustav's shoulder and said he needed to follow him. And at this point, Gustav's stomach dropped. He assumed he was about to be taken away, to be punished for asking about Edward in the first place. And so Gustav's hands were shaking and his heart was racing as he followed the guard out of the palace and out into the courtyard. There were some horses tied up and waiting for them. Gustav felt nauseous as he followed the guard through the city streets, and he wondered if he should just try to make a break for it and try to escape. But he looked down different streets and alleys and realized that would be totally useless. The palace guards would find him in minutes. So there was nowhere for him to go. And so Gustav had no choice but to just keep on following this guard. Through the city they went. And then eventually they got to the city gates. And Gustav was horrified as they left the city and just began riding out into the wilderness over towards this huge mountain in the distance. And as they were making their way towards this mountain, all Gustav was thinking is that at any moment here, they're going to just dump me here to die, or they're going to ambush me, or something bad is going to happen. At some point, the guard led Gustav all the way to the foot of that mountain. And there, the guard abruptly stopped and climbed off his horse. He just turned around and faced Gustav. And he says, "I am going to tell you exactly what happened to Edward." And Gustav was kind of shocked by this. He really didn't know what was going to happen here. He didn't even know if he was still in danger at this point. But now he was just holding his breath, waiting for this mystery to potentially finally be solved. And so the guard, he looked at Gustav and he said, "Edward committed an unforgivable crime." And he was punished for that crime. Now, at this point, Gustav was shocked. Edward was this very well-traveled and highly respected guy. And it just didn't make sense that he would commit any crime, let alone an unforgivable one that apparently cost him his life. And so Gustav kind of blurted out, "What crime? What did he do?" The guard explained that from day one, Edward had made lots of enemies in Abbashir. He basically spent his days riding all around the city and staring at everybody and writing in his notebooks, but never talking to anybody. And so people began to gossip that maybe he was a spy. And then also, the guard said Edward had climbed their sacred mountain despite being told not to, the mountain that was literally right behind them. And then also, the guard said Edward was just totally unpleasant and just kind of a snobby person that nobody liked. But the guard said, none of that is actually what caused Edward to be punished. Edward's unforgivable crime, the one that caused his downfall, was his insatiable hunger for eggs. At every single meal, he refused all the food his noble host prepared for him and demanded eggs. In Abbashir, eggs were quite rare and were considered a precious gift. And Edward demanded them at every single meal, and he ate all of that noble family's eggs. And so eventually, the nobles, they could not stand Edward's disrespect. And so they went to the king. And the king, who agreed this was just awful what Edward had done, decided the only appropriate punishment was to take Edward and drag him out to the base of that sacred mountain and literally beat him to death. Dr. Edward Vogel, the proud symbol of Germany's exploring spirit, was executed because he ate an offensive number of eggs. Gustav was unharmed. He, unlike Edward, had actually bothered to learn the local customs and was highly respectful. And so he was allowed to leave the city even after being told what happened to Edward. And he would become the first European ever to leave Abbashir alive. As for Edward's notebooks and maps, they were never found. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Just after midnight on the 12th of May, 2006, a man was sleeping soundly inside his home in a quiet London suburb. Suddenly, he was jolted awake by a loud, frantic pounding on his front door. It wasn't just a knock, it was the sound of someone in a total panic. He immediately threw the covers off, got out of bed, and rushed to see who it was. When he opened the door, he found one of his neighbors standing on his porch, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. The neighbor struggled to get the words out, but he finally managed to tell the man that something absolutely horrible had happened to his sister. As soon as those words registered, the man didn't even stop to put on shoes. He just left his house and sprinted down the dark road, heading straight for his sister's house just a short distance away. As he ran, his heart hammered against his ribs. He was terrified of what he was going to find when he got there. He was always telling his sister to be more careful, to be more aware of her surroundings. But she was so confident, so independent, she never seemed to listen to his warnings. And now he had a sinking feeling that his worst fears were coming true. When he finally reached her house, the first thing he saw under the dim glow of the streetlights was a dark, glistening trail of blood leading right down her driveway. On the evening of the 11th of May, 2006, just a few hours earlier, a 29-year-old hairdresser named Nisha Patel Nazari was sitting down for a rare break. She was in her hair salon, located in the Wembley district of London, in between clients. Nisha was the kind of person who was always on the go. She had opened up this very salon when she was only 18 years old, and for the last 11 years she had poured her heart and soul into it, running it all by herself. In that time, she had built up an incredible base of around 2,000 regular customers. This was impressive for any business owner, but it was especially impressive considering her salon wasn't some big, fancy shop on a bustling city street. Instead, it was a tiny, unassuming shop on a quiet residential road far out in the northwest suburbs of London. In fact, she operated the entire business out of a single room in her brother's house. But through her incredible work ethic and her sheer talent with a pair of scissors, she had turned it into a thriving, successful business. Generally, Nisha was glad to be so busy. Being busy meant she was making good money, building the life she wanted. But sometimes, like right at this moment, she really welcomed the chance to just stop, kick her feet up, and relax for a few minutes. So she settled into one of the salon chairs, grabbed the morning paper that was lying on a nearby table, and started to read. The front page story was about the government's recently released report on the July 7th bombings from the previous year. Those bombings were a coordinated series of terrorist attacks that had struck London's public transport system, trains and buses, during the peak of the morning rush hour. It had been nearly 10 months since those horrific attacks, but the sense of security in London was still shattered. People just didn't feel safe anymore. The attacks had created this lingering, pervasive fear of all kinds of violent crime. It felt like anything could happen to anyone at any time. And Nisha, perhaps more than most people, really understood why people felt that way. She had a very personal reason for feeling on edge. In fact, just 5 days ago, she had experienced an attempted home invasion. She had been at her own house, which was only about a block away from the salon, making dinner in the kitchen. Suddenly, she heard a strange rattling sound coming from the front of the house. It was the mail slot on her front door. On her door, there was a small metal flap that could be pushed open from the outside, allowing the mail carrier to slide letters and parcels right into her house. When Nisha first heard the noise, she didn't immediately panic. It was a normal sound, something she heard almost every day. But something about it felt different this time. Curiosity got the better of her, so she walked to the front of the house and peered out a window to see who was there. She expected to see the mail carrier, or maybe a neighbor dropping something off, or even a friend. But when she looked out, it was none of those people. Instead, she saw 3 men she didn't recognize, all dressed in dark clothing. And they weren't delivering mail. It was immediately obvious to her that they were trying to break into her house. Now, these men had definitely picked the wrong house to target. Because in addition to being a skilled hairdresser, Nisha was also a special constable. This was essentially a part-time volunteer police officer. So, instead of hiding or panicking or calling for help, Nisha's instinct was to confront them. She opened her front door and strode out onto her porch with a level of confidence that clearly caught them completely off guard. She called out to them, demanding to know what they were doing. The 3 men were so startled by her bravery that they literally just turned around and ran away down the street. Even though Nisha had handled the situation perfectly and had scared them off, the experience left her feeling deeply unsettled. That incident, combined with the lasting trauma that all Londoners were feeling from the bombings the year before, meant that Nisha was feeling very much on edge these days. But every time Nisha found herself starting to feel like a victim, starting to let fear take over, she would remind herself of her training. She was a special constable. She was trained to handle difficult situations. Whatever problems came her way, she would deal with them, just like she always did. This thought was a source of confidence for her, but for some people in her family, it was a source of constant worry. Her older brother, Caden, in particular, the one who owned the house where she ran her salon, was not thrilled about her police work. He had begged her not to join the special constable program. He felt the work was far too dangerous for a volunteer. The newspapers were constantly filled with stories about attacks on police officers, and unlike full-time officers, special constables weren't authorized to carry weapons to defend themselves. But for Nisha, that was never a concern. She was incredibly proud of what she was doing. She felt that now, more than ever, with everyone so on edge after the July 7th bombings, it was the time for people to step up and do their part to keep London safe. And she truly believed that's what she was doing. As Nisha finished reading the front page of the paper in her salon, she heard the little bell on the front door jingle. She neatly folded the newspaper, tucked it away, hopped up from her chair, and went to greet her next client. Later that night, around 10 o'clock, Nisha closed up her shop for the day. She swept the floor, tidying up the last bits of hair from her final client. A few minutes later, she heard the front door jingle again. She looked up and saw her husband, a man named Fode Nasri, walking in. He was holding a paper bag that smelled deliciously of takeout food. Nisha instinctively called up the stairs for her brother, Caden, who had come home from work earlier that evening and had been relaxing in his part of the house. A moment later, Caden came down the stairs to join the couple for a late dinner. Fode spread out the plastic containers of Indian food on the coffee table in the salon's waiting area. Caden started to eat while Fode went and sat down in Nisha's salon chair. It was time for his haircut. Nisha was especially careful and precise with his haircut tonight. She and her husband were going to her brother's wedding in just a couple of days, and they both knew they would be in all the wedding pictures. They wanted to look their absolute best. While she carefully trimmed Fode's hair, she helped her brother talk through some of the last-minute preparations for the wedding. Their mother and father had both passed away years ago, so when it came to big family events like this, the two siblings really had to rely on each other. Caden reminisced about how he had been the one to give Nisha away at her own wedding. Since their father couldn't be there, he had stepped in to walk her down the aisle. That wedding had been exactly 3 years ago yesterday. Nisha smiled as she continued cutting Fode's hair. Thinking about their anniversary reminded her of how grateful she was for her husband and the life they had built together. Just a few months after they had gotten married, Nisha had loaned Fode some money to start his own business, a limousine rental company. His business had really taken off, and Nisha was so proud to see her husband working such long hours and making great money. It felt like they were a real team, two ambitious and successful business owners working together to build a better future for themselves. Once Fode's haircut was done, Nisha called Caden over and gave him a pre-wedding trim as well. As she was finishing up, Caden asked her if maybe she and Fode wanted to spend the night at his house. He was still rattled by that attempted break-in at Nisha's house a few days earlier, and he just didn't feel like she was safe staying in her own home. But Nisha just brushed off his concerns. She told him, "No, we're fine." So, around 11 o'clock that night, Nisha and her husband Fode walked home. Their house was just around the corner, a cream-colored two-story home with red shingles on the roof. Parked in the driveway was Fode's car, and along the curb were a stretch limo and a Humvee that Fode used for his business. Both vehicles stood out quite a bit in their quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Nisha unlocked the front door, and they went inside. She tossed her phone and keys onto the sofa, and then went straight upstairs to get ready for bed. But while she was in the bathroom washing her face, Fode popped his head in. He told her he was heading back out to meet a friend to play snooker, which is what they call pool in the UK. Now, Nisha wasn't offended that he wanted to go out and see his friend. That was perfectly fine. But in reality, she and Fode had been talking a lot recently about starting a family. For the most part, they had both agreed that now was the right time to start trying to have kids. And so, in the back of her mind, she had been thinking that maybe tonight, they could try to have a baby. But it seemed like not just tonight, but generally speaking, every time there was an opportunity, every time the moment seemed right, Fode was either too tired or he was going out with his friends. It just felt like he would say he was interested in starting a family, but when it came time to actually do something about it, he was nowhere to be found. And it seemed like that was happening again tonight. But it was late, and Nisha was tired. She really didn't feel like getting into an argument with her husband, so she just dried her face and told Fode to have fun with his friend. A few minutes later, as Nisha was brushing her teeth, she heard the sound of her husband's car engine start up and then pull out of the driveway. A little while later, she went downstairs, turned off all the lights, and made sure the doors were locked. Then she went back upstairs and crawled into bed, alone. About 30 minutes passed. Right as Nisha was on the verge of falling asleep, she heard a sound from downstairs. It sounded like footsteps. She sat up in bed, listening intently. She hadn't heard her husband's car return home. She hadn't heard the front door open. She just heard these quiet footsteps moving around in her house. Her mind immediately raced. It could be her husband, maybe he came back quietly. Or, because of what had happened less than a week ago, she thought, are they back? Has someone broken into my house? Not sure who was down there, she quietly got out of bed. She grabbed a heavy flashlight from her nightstand, tiptoed out of her bedroom, and began to creep downstairs to see who was in her house. Just a few minutes later, one of Nisha's neighbors was woken up by blood-curdling screams coming from the street right outside his house. He jumped out of bed, ran to his window, and pulled back the curtain. When he looked out, he saw an unbelievable sight. It was Nisha, limping down the middle of the street in her nightgown, holding a flashlight in her hand. The neighbor instinctively grabbed his phone and called for an ambulance, then he rushed outside to help her. When he caught up to Nisha, she was hobbling back up her own driveway. He asked her if she was okay, what had happened. She just choked out the words that she'd been stabbed. But before she could say who had done it, her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the cold pavement, clutching a bloody spot on her thigh. At that exact moment, the neighbor looked up from Nisha and saw a man in a dark hooded sweatshirt running away down the street. By this point, the commotion had woken up other people on the block. More neighbors were trickling out of their houses to see what was going on. Another woman ran over to where Nisha was on the ground. She had a towel with her and she began pressing it onto Nisha's leg, trying to stop the bleeding. As soon as the first neighbor, the one who had seen the man running away, heard the sound of ambulance sirens approaching, he stood up. He bolted down the road to find Nisha's brother to tell him what had happened and what he had just seen. Just was 3, a few minutes before midnight, a man named Nick Scola felt his pager buzz. He was a detective chief inspector working out of the Wembley station. That night, he was the senior investigator on call, the person who gets notified if any major crimes happen in the area. He'd been hoping he could get through his shift without any emergencies. But when he called the station to find out what the page was about, he could tell from the dispatcher's tone that this was serious. The dispatcher told him to get to 17 Sudbury Avenue as quickly as he possibly could. So Scola hopped in his car and sped off. A few minutes later, he pulled up to a scene of total chaos on a residential street. In the driveway of a cream-colored house with red shingles, paramedics were carefully loading a young woman onto a stretcher and into an ambulance. Police officers were already there, cordoning off the entire area with yellow crime scene tape, trying to keep a growing crowd of agitated and restless neighbors at a distance. As Scola got out of his car and walked closer to the house, he could see a dark trail of blood staining the driveway. He flashed his badge to the officers standing guard at the perimeter, and they lifted the tape to let him through. One of the officers quickly briefed him. There had been a stabbing, and the victim, the young woman, was in critical condition. While the officers were filling him in on what little they knew so far, Scola noticed a car pull up abruptly out on the street. A man jumped out of the car and began running towards the house. As he got closer, it was clear he was completely hysterical, crying and screaming. Scola could hear him frantically telling the paramedics that he was the victim's husband. Scola saw this unfold and made a mental note. He knew he needed to interview that man as soon as he had a better grasp of what he was dealing with here. Scola's eyes scanned the property. He noticed the stretch limousine and the black Humvee parked in front of the house. Those were expensive vehicles, the kind of thing that might attract burglars. His initial thought was that maybe this was a simple robbery gone wrong. Maybe the victim had come home and surprised the burglars in the act. But when Scola walked up the driveway, past the forensics team that was already taking photographs and collecting evidence, he looked closely at the front door. He also examined the windows near the front door. He saw no signs of forced entry at all. There were no pry marks, no broken glass, no damage whatsoever. Scola then walked around to the back of the house to check the back door. It was the same situation. The back door, the only other entrance into the house, also showed no signs of being forced open. Scola then went inside the house. He started in the living room. Everything was neat and tidy. Nothing was broken, nothing was out of place. In fact, he saw a wallet and a stack of cash sitting out in the open on a table, completely untouched. At this point, his initial theory of a robbery was looking less and less likely. A burglar wouldn't just leave cash sitting there. Scola left the living room and went into the kitchen. And there, he noticed something significant. On the counter, there was a wooden butcher block for holding knives. And it was clearly missing one of its knives. There was an empty slot. This butcher block wasn't just sitting out in the open. It was at the very back of the counter, tucked behind a bunch of other items, including a row of delicate champagne glasses that didn't look like they had been disturbed at all. So, he figured that this knife couldn't have been taken during some kind of violent struggle. If someone had been fighting with the victim in the kitchen, they would have knocked over those glasses and other things. The knife had to have been taken when things were relatively calm in the house. Based on these initial observations, Scola began to piece together a working theory of what might have happened. He thought that the victim, the young woman, must have heard a noise that spooked her. So she went into her kitchen and carefully took a knife from the block to protect herself. Then, maybe she stepped outside to investigate the noise. As soon as she got out there, her attacker or whoever was making the noises, maybe someone trying to break in, must have seen her. They got into some kind of altercation, the knife was taken from her, and then she was stabbed with her own knife. Of course, this was all just speculation at this point. Scola had no idea if it was true, but it was a theory that seemed to explain the strange details he was seeing so far. A few minutes later, Scola went back outside to speak to some of the neighbors who had gathered in the street. One neighbor told Scola that he had actually seen a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away from the scene right after the attack. But the neighbor said he hadn't seen the man's face, so he couldn't provide a description. At this point, Scola figured the most important thing he could do was to speak to the victim herself as soon as she was stable. She would obviously be able to give a much better description of what happened and who her attacker was. But unfortunately, less than an hour later, while Scola was still at the crime scene, trying to take it all in and gather evidence, his phone rang. It was a call from the hospital. His stabbing victim, Nisha Patel Nasri, had bled to death on the way to the hospital. This was now officially a murder investigation. The next morning, after Detective Scola had finally finished processing the crime scene, he walked into the Wembley police station. The atmosphere was unusually quiet and somber. All the other officers looked grim-faced. A little bit confused, Scola asked one of his colleagues what was going on. She told him that the victim from last night's murder, Nisha, was one of their own. She was a special constable, and plenty of the officers in that very station had worked with her. Scola now understood the heavy mood in the room. This was a gut punch to the entire department. But this information was also very interesting to Scola from an investigative standpoint. At first, he had thought Nisha was killed in a random robbery gone wrong. But now, Scola started to wonder if this murder was not random at all. Maybe Nisha was targeted specifically because she was a police officer. Maybe there was a criminal she had helped put behind bars, someone who was now out and seeking revenge. As Scola began to do some digging into Nisha's background and her police work, he learned about the attempted break-in at her house just a few days earlier. He learned about the 3 men she had scared off. Now Scola was thinking that this could not be a coincidence. So right away, he assigned a team of officers to get to work trying to identify those 3 men who had tried to break into Nisha's house. While they did that, Scola headed back to the crime scene. He wanted to see if his team could find that knife that was missing from the kitchen. He was almost certain at this point that it had to be the murder weapon. And if it was, the killer's fingerprints or even their DNA could be on it. When Scola pulled up on Sudbury Avenue later that day, he saw swarms of reporters and TV news cameras crowding around the house. The crime scene tape was still up, keeping them at bay. As Scola approached, a reporter noticed him and ran towards him with a microphone, starting to shout questions. The main question was whether the police had any idea why a special constable had been murdered at her own home. But Scola just brushed the reporter off. He wasn't about to talk to the press about an active murder investigation, especially when he really didn't have any concrete information to share yet. He ducked under the police tape and went back inside the cordoned-off area. Once inside, Scola saw dozens of officers meticulously scouring the entire area, all of them looking for the missing knife. They were dumping out trash cans, digging through bushes, checking every nook and cranny. Scola caught the eye of one of the lead investigators, and she just gave him a slight shrug. Scola took that to mean they hadn't found it yet. He also watched as 2 other officers hauled a high-powered industrial vacuum out of a truck. They carried it over to a storm drain on the curb just down the street from the house. They turned on the vacuum and began sucking up everything from inside the drain, hoping the knife had been tossed in there. Scola walked over to them just as they were beginning to sift through the contents they had sucked up. The vacuum had pulled up a whole mess of stuff: leaves, trash, old food wrappers. But after carefully picking through all of it, they confirmed there was no knife. Still, Scola figured the killer must have dumped the knife somewhere near the crime scene. They couldn't have gotten very far before realizing they needed to get rid of the murder weapon. So, Scola felt confident that the knife was going to turn up eventually. They just had to keep looking. In the meantime, Scola went back inside the house. There, he found a pair of investigators sitting in the living room with Nisha's husband, Fode. Fode had his phone out, and he was playing a recording of a woman's voice. She was shouting violent threats. One of the officers saw Scola and pulled him aside to bring him up to speed. They told him that Fode had a solid alibi for the time of Nisha's murder. He was at a snooker hall with a friend several miles away, and that friend had already confirmed his story. The officer also told Scola that Fode had come forward and said he had a pretty good idea of who might have killed his wife. So, Scola sat down on the couch next to Fode. Fode then began to tell his story from the beginning. He said that 2 months ago, he'd gotten into a feud with a rival limousine business owner based in Scotland. He explained that he had sold a Humvee to this other company, but the sale was made under the condition that after the transaction was complete, Fode could borrow the vehicle back for one last job he had booked. But, he said, the owner of the other company had gone back on the deal and refused to let him borrow the car. So, in what Fode described as a moment of poor judgment, he had traveled up to Scotland, rented the Humvee from the company under a fake name, and then driven it all the way back down to London. But then, Fode said, while he was driving back to London, the other owner must have figured out what he had done because they gave him a call. Fode didn't answer, so they left a voicemail. He had recorded it. Fode then played the recording of this voicemail for Scola. And Scola heard a woman's voice screaming over and over again that she was going to kill Fode and his wife if he didn't bring her Humvee back. As Scola listened, he thought this woman did not sound like she was joking around. This sounded like a very real, very serious threat. Now, Fode said that he did eventually return the Humvee. He gave it back to the business owner, so technically she no longer had a reason to want to kill him and his wife. Still, Fode felt strongly that this woman really had it out for them, and he wanted the police to look into her. For Scola, this was one of the only concrete leads they had. So he figured it was worth checking out. He took Fode's phone so he could download that audio recording and also get a copy of all his call logs. And then he promised Fode that he would send a team up to Scotland to investigate this woman right away. One afternoon, about a month later, Detective Scola was sitting in his office alone. He was going over the case files again and again, feeling the pressure mount. The media had been covering Nisha's murder relentlessly since day one, and there was a lot of public pressure to solve the case. But the police had been investigating it aggressively for a full month and had almost nothing to show for it. Ever since Scola's last conversation with Fode, the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. The detectives he'd sent to Scotland to look into the rival business owner had come back empty-handed. They hadn't found anything notable, so that lead was looking like a complete bust. Also, the homicide team had still not been able to identify the 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house 5 days before she was killed. Scola and his team had interviewed Nisha's family, all her friends, her neighbors, but so far they had not been able to identify any other likely suspects. It just didn't seem like there was anyone in the world who would have wanted to hurt Nisha. She was liked and respected by basically everyone they spoke to. However, there had been one pretty significant development in the case over the past month. The police had finally found a knife that looked very similar to the one that was missing from Nisha's kitchen. It was found in a storm drain about a block away from her house. But Scola was still waiting for the crime lab to confirm whether or not it was actually the murder weapon. But just then, as he was thinking about it, Scola got a phone call. It was someone from the crime lab. They told him that after analyzing the knife, they had found traces of Nisha's blood on the blade. This was it. This was definitely the murder weapon. For the first time in weeks, Scola felt a surge of optimism. He finally had a real piece of hard evidence, a fresh clue that could lead the investigation in a new direction. He needed all hands on deck now. So he hung up the phone and immediately gathered his entire team for a meeting. Once they were all assembled, he told the other detectives that they had found the murder weapon. But, he stressed, they had to keep this discovery a secret. If the killer found out that the police had the knife, they might panic and flee. To avoid jeopardizing the investigation, Scola wanted to keep this new development completely out of the press. After everyone was on the same page, the next step in the investigation was clear. Scola was going to send officers out to collect video footage from all the security cameras near the storm drain where the knife had been found. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the entire world, with hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras on nearly every street. So, Scola figured that one of those cameras must have captured the person who dropped that knife into the drain. The homicide squad spent the rest of the week combing through countless hours of CCTV footage from the area, hoping to find that one crucial moment when the knife was disposed of. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But after about a week of this tedious work, another detective eagerly called Scola over to his computer. He said he had finally found something that could be useful. Scola walked over, and the detective explained that the footage he was looking at was from a CCTV camera mounted on a shop that was on the same road as the storm drain. Scola bent down and stared at the screen as the detective hit play on the video. The storm drain itself was just barely out of the camera's frame, but the camera clearly captured the bright glow of headlights as a car pulled up near the drain. The car stopped there for about 7 seconds. And even though you couldn't see anyone get out and drop a knife into the drain, the car was stopped for long enough that someone definitely could have done that before the car took off again. And critically, when the car did take off again, it passed directly through the camera's frame, very clearly. As the car drove past the storefront, the detective paused the video. As soon as he did, Scola leaned in even closer to get a better look at the car. The video was dark and grainy, so it was impossible to read the license plate. But despite the poor quality, there were a few identifying details that Scola could make out. The car was clearly a gray Audi. There was an antenna in the center of the roof. And also, one of the small lights that illuminates the license plate was not working. Now, Scola knew there were literally tens of thousands of gray Audis in London, so he knew the only way they were going to track this specific one down was by sending officers out into the street to literally look for it. What they were looking for was a gray Audi that had an antenna on the roof and a broken license plate light. This was going to be an extremely time-consuming and difficult task, but Scola felt like they didn't have a better lead to follow. So they began the process. And for the next few weeks, that's all they did, just canvassing the streets of London looking for this specific Audi, and they didn't find it. As the investigation was feeling like it was about to hit another dead end, Scola felt he just couldn't let that happen. The pressure on him to solve this case was immense. But then suddenly, he thought about something that he had totally put out of his mind. Fode's phone. They had taken the phone from Fode 2 months ago to download that voicemail and his call logs, but they had never actually given it back to him. The phone was just sitting in an evidence locker. Scola felt like the audio message on the phone hadn't really amounted to anything, but he figured, why not take another look at the phone to see what else is on there? Maybe there were other clues on it about who might have wanted to hurt Nisha. So he assigned one of his forensic technicians to download everything from Fode's phone onto a hard drive. Once they had done that, Scola took the drive back to his office, plugged it into his computer, and began sorting through all the data. As he was scrolling through the files, he saw a photo that caught his eye. The photo was of a woman's thigh. She was clearly lying in a bed in what looked like a hotel room. And even with the bright camera flash and the poor quality of the photo, Scola could tell that the woman's skin was pale white. It was definitely not Nisha's leg. After finding this photo on Fode's phone, Scola immediately drove to Nisha and Fode's house. When Fode opened the door, Scola stepped inside, showed him the photo on his own phone, and asked him point blank if he was having an affair. Fode right away said no. He insisted he would never do that to Nisha. He claimed the woman in the picture was just a friend. Scola immediately felt that Fode was lying. He didn't believe him for a second. But there was no way to force Fode to tell the truth. So, ultimately, all Scola could do was leave, get back in his car, and go back to the station. On the drive there, he wondered to himself if he had just blown a huge opportunity. Maybe he should have waited for more solid evidence before confronting Fode. But he was also thinking that with so much pressure on him to solve the case, he had to take some chances, make some bold moves. When Scola got back to the precinct, he parked his car and went into his office to think. Almost as soon as he sat down, there was a knock at his door. It was a man named Sid Shenoy. He was the family liaison officer who had been working closely with Nisha's family. His job was to support the grieving family and to communicate with them throughout the investigation. As a result of this role, Sid had built a level of trust with the family that none of the other detectives had. Shenoy walked into the room and told Scola that he had just gotten a very interesting phone call from Fode. He said that Fode had confessed something to him, something he had been too afraid to tell Scola in person when he had just been at his house a few minutes ago. Shenoy told Scola that he really ought to call Fode and let him tell him what he had just told him. So, right away, that's what Scola did. He called Fode. When Fode picked up, he sounded very nervous and anxious and ashamed. He broke down and admitted that yes, he was having an affair. He had lied. He said the leg in the photo belonged to a woman named Laura Makin, and she was a Lithuanian sex worker who he had been seeing for about 3 months before his wife's death. Fode said the reason he had lied to Scola was because he didn't want Nisha's family to find out that he had been cheating on her. But Scola knew there was another, more obvious reason for him to lie. An affair would clearly give Fode a motive to kill his wife. Fode had been crossed off the suspect list early on because of his alibi. But this affair now made him look extremely suspicious. However, Scola just felt like it didn't quite make sense that Fode would be the killer. For one, he did have a very strong alibi. And two, apart from hiding this affair, which you could argue was to protect the family from more pain, he had been very cooperative with the investigation. He had willingly given them his phone, the very phone that had this damning photo on it. He had seemed very forthright. And so, a new theory began to take hold in Skola's mind. If Fode wasn't the killer, maybe it was possible that his mistress, Laura, was. Or at least, maybe she was directly involved in some way. She would have had a very strong reason to want to get rid of Nisha. So, on September 1st, almost 4 months after Nisha was murdered, her husband's mistress, Laura Machen, was brought into the station on suspicion of murder. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted her with all the evidence they had gathered that showed her relationship with Fode was not just a casual affair. The two of them had met at a brothel where Laura was working, but eventually she had stopped charging him to see her, which suggested to the detectives that she must have developed real feelings for him. The detectives suggested that if Nisha was gone for good, Laura would have Fode all to herself. Laura insisted she knew nothing about the murder. And then she gave them a solid alibi for the night of the crime. But that didn't mean much, because the eyewitnesses thought they saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away. So the working theory was that if Laura was involved, she had likely hired someone else to do the dirty work. However, the detectives didn't have any real hard evidence linking her to the crime. So, despite their strong suspicions, they had no choice but to release her. And then, once again, they were back at square one. However, not long after Laura was allowed to go home, Skola was walking through the precinct when the family liaison officer, Sid Shenoy, came running up behind him again. Shenoy told him that he had just had a very interesting conversation with Nisha's brother, Caden. Caden had told him that after finding out about Fode's affair, he had been absolutely furious. The whole family was devastated and upset. And Caden said that now that he had this horrible new opinion of Fode, he felt comfortable sharing something about him that he had been keeping to himself. Caden told Shenoy that he thought Fode might not be the professional, successful businessman he pretended to be. Instead, Caden suspected that Fode might actually be involved in something criminal. According to Caden, Fode had once mentioned that there were a lot of sketchy people in his phone contacts, and he was worried about what the police might find on his phone. But Caden said that Fode hadn't been specific about what he meant by sketchy people. He didn't know who they were or why Fode was involved with them. After hearing this, Skola immediately told his team to go back through Fode's phone records and run the name of every single person who appeared in his call log. Apart from all the calls back and forth to his mistress, Laura, there was one other name that immediately jumped out at them. A convicted drug dealer named Roger Leslie. When Skola saw this name, he realized that he might have been approaching this entire investigation from the wrong angle. He had struggled to find suspects because there seemed to be no one who would have wanted to hurt Nisha who didn't also have a solid alibi. But now he realized that maybe that was the case because Nisha was never the killer's intended target. Maybe the real target was Fode. If Fode was involved in the drug trade, then anyone could have come after him for any number of reasons. It could have been a drug deal gone wrong, or retribution for a debt he didn't pay, or maybe even a hit ordered by a rival gang. He didn't know. But there were suddenly way more possibilities. And the more Skola dug into Fode's life, the more suspicious evidence he found. He learned that before Fode and Nisha got married, Fode had run an escort agency. He had closed it down and started his more legitimate limousine business 3 years ago. But Skola knew there could be any number of former employees or customers, or even customers' wives, who might still have a problem with Fode. And then there was that threatening voicemail from the rival limo company. That whole story made it seem entirely possible that Fode could easily get himself wrapped up in very serious business disputes, which meant there could be more disgruntled rivals out there. Basically, it seemed entirely possible that there were loads of people out there who might have had it out for Fode, not Nisha. And so, that became the new direction of the investigation. The first person Skola looked into with this new direction was Roger Leslie, the drug dealer who had made a few calls to Fode. However, there was one issue that kept Roger from becoming a primary suspect. He didn't own a gray Audi. So, if he was involved in the murder, he probably didn't work alone. The police set up a trace on Roger Leslie's phone, hoping that his call logs would lead them to an associate who did own a gray Audi. And eventually, they sure did. And that person who owned the gray Audi was the missing piece of the puzzle that made everything finally come together. Based on those call logs and all the other evidence that had been found during this long investigation, the following is what police believe actually happened to Nisha Patel Nasri on the night of the 11th of May, 2006. Around 11:50 p.m., just as Nisha was falling asleep, the killer pulled up to her house in the passenger seat of a gray Audi. The driver waited in the car while the killer got out and crept around to the back of the house. As he walked, he kept looking in the windows, confirming that all the lights inside were out. And they were. When he got to the back door, he pulled out a key that he had managed to get his hands on and unlocked it. Once the door was open, he quietly stepped inside. The killer slowly moved through the dark kitchen and then froze. He heard the floorboards upstairs creak. He held his breath as he realized that somebody upstairs was awake and was making their way downstairs. He was caught. The killer didn't know what to do. He hadn't prepared for this at all. The plan was that everyone in the house would be asleep. So, he panicked. He reached over to the counter, pulled a long knife out of the butcher's block, and then quickly ducked behind a wall to hide. He heard the footsteps getting closer and closer. He tried his best to stay hidden in the shadows. Then he saw a bright beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness of the kitchen. The beam moved across the room and then landed squarely right on him. The person holding that flashlight was Fode's wife, Nisha. When Nisha saw the intruder, she let out a piercing scream and turned to run for the front door. But the killer knew he could not let her get away. She had gotten a clear look at his face. He was caught. So he chased after her out of the house and into the driveway, clutching that kitchen knife in his hand. About halfway down the driveway, he managed to tackle her to the ground. Then he plunged the knife deep into her thigh. Despite the gaping wound in her leg, Nisha somehow managed to fight him off. She scrambled back to her feet and began running down the street, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. At this point, the killer saw lights coming on in the neighbors' houses. His heart was pounding in his chest. He knew that Nisha was no longer his biggest problem. He had to get out of there immediately before anyone else on the block saw his face. So he just sprinted back to the gray Audi where the driver was still waiting for him. He jumped in and screamed at the driver to just take off and get out of there. The driver, panicked and confused, did just that. As they sped away, the driver was asking the killer what had just happened. As far as the driver knew, they were only there to pick up some ecstasy for a drug deal. They did not expect anyone to get stabbed. But the killer just snapped at the driver to stop talking about it. He hadn't expected the night to go this way either. It was a total mess. At this point, the killer looked down at the bloody knife that was still in his hand and realized he had to get rid of it. He told the driver to just pull over. The driver pulled over to the curb on a commercial street just a block away from Nisha's house. The killer quickly opened his door, leaned out, and threw the knife into a nearby storm drain. Then he slammed the door shut again. As the Audi sped down the road, the killer took the driver's cell phone from the cup holder and made a call. He called the man who had hired him to tell him that everything had just gone horribly, horribly wrong. The person he called was the drug dealer, Roger Leslie. However, when Roger Leslie got off that phone call with the killer, Roger immediately made another call. He called the person who had hired him. Roger had been contracted to pull off a hit, but he didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he had outsourced the job to someone else. But now, after hearing from the killer about this botched hit, where they had stabbed the target but had no idea if she was actually going to die, in fact, the last they saw of her, she was running down the road, screaming for help. Roger knew he would have to explain himself. He had to explain the situation to the actual mastermind of the murder plot, the person who had given him the key to get inside the house in the first place. And that person was indeed Fode Nasri, Nisha's husband. It turned out that Fode was involved with a bunch of criminals, but they weren't after him. They were his associates. Because even though Fode pretended to be this successful, legitimate businessman, he really was not. He was deep in debt, and he had paid Roger Leslie to kill his wife, Nisha, so he could collect the life insurance money. That way, he could pay off all his debts and then run off with his new mistress, Laura. So, while Nisha had been wanting to start a family and was sensing that maybe Fode wasn't fully committed to the idea, her instincts were spot on. It turned out Fode didn't want to start a family with her at all. He wanted to kill her and move on with his life. According to prosecutors, that earlier attempted break-in at Nisha and Fode's house a few days before she was killed was very likely either a reconnaissance mission or a failed first attempt to carry out the murder. In the end, 4 people were arrested and charged with Nisha's murder. They were Fode Nasri, Roger Leslie, the hitman who actually stabbed Nisha, whose name was Jason Jones, and the driver of the car, a man named Tony Emanuel. At trial, the driver, Tony Emanuel, was acquitted of all charges. But the other 3 men, Fode Nasri, the mastermind, Roger Leslie, the middleman, and Jason Jones, the killer, were all found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the year 2025, on June 29th, a woman by the name of June Baxter, who was 83 years old at the time, made her way slowly down the hallway of her simple home in Attleborough, which is a small town located in the eastern region of England. Her passing occurred at approximately 8:20 in the morning, according to the exact time. She suffered from a number of medical conditions that caused her to be rather fragile. As a result of these conditions, she was required to keep one hand on the wall in order to maintain her balance or stability while she was walking. For her to be able to walk, this was an essential requirement. Despite the difficulties she faced on a physical level, June placed a larger focus on her independence than she did on anything else. This was the case regardless of the circumstances. This was something that she was extremely excited to continue doing, despite the fact that her family believed that she was taking a little bit of a risk by continuing to live on her own in her own house. She was really eager to continue having this experience. During the time when June, her husband, and their cherished little puppy were all living in this house together, there was a period of time when they were all living there together. It was a pattern that was comfortable, there was a lot of life going on, and the house was full of people going about their everyday lives. From the flip side of the coin, it is important to note that her spouse had been diagnosed with a serious illness around 7 years before to this event. Because his illness required a big amount of care and attention, June and he were forced to make the painful decision of entrusting their dog to their granddaughter during this period of time. This decision was made because of the fact that his condition required a significant amount of care and attention. To put it another way, they were not able to successfully manage the responsibility of taking care of a pet while simultaneously monitoring his health. In spite of the fact that it was a particularly sad day, they arrived at the conclusion that it was the most prudent choice. June's husband passed away almost soon after that, and the house was suddenly filled with an awful sense of emptiness. June's spouse had been dying for quite some time. Only she was the only one who was by herself. On the other hand, the fact that she was within the confines of the house by herself did not necessarily imply that she was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The woman who had taken in her dog was not only her granddaughter, but also her grandchild, and she lived in close proximity to her the entire time. June was a constant presence in her life, and anytime she entered her environment, she welcomed her with open arms. June was a constant presence in her life. She would nearly always bring June's aged dog along with her on her regular visits. This was something that she did virtually every time. This is the manner in which she would conduct herself the vast majority of the time. Throughout those exchanges, June maintained an attitude that was one of complete and full joy. As she gazed at her dog and felt the familiar fur of her dog under her fingertips, she experienced a sense of comfort that was impossible to put into words. She felt a sense of comfort at the same time. The fact that she was thinking about her puppy allowed her to be successful in achieving this goal. Not only did June's granddaughter provide her happiness, but she also went out of her way to save her in a number of different ways. June cherished her grandchild above all else in the world. In no way, shape, or form did she ever find herself in a situation in which she was unable to offer June support with the practical duties that had become rather challenging for her. She would be responsible for performing the weekly grocery shopping, picking up her prescriptions, and picking up her meds from the pharmacy, in addition to transporting her to and from each of her doctor's appointments. In addition, she would be responsible for taking her to and from hospital appointments. Her granddaughter had made it abundantly clear on multiple occasions that all June needed to do was call, and she would be there instantly without any questions being asked. This was the only thing that June needed to do. June simply needed to provide this one command in order to complete the task. June, who had a personality that was fiercely independent, made every attempt to avoid imposing an excessive amount of dependence on her granddaughter. This was despite the fact that June had a personality that was fiercely independent. By any stretch of the imagination, she had no intention of being a burden to anyone. The most essential thing for her was to demonstrate to herself that she was still capable of standing on her own and handling things. She was mostly driven by this motivation. Something that she could look back on with a great deal of pride was the moment in question. Therefore, on this particular morning, she was simply concentrating on her routine daily ritual as she made her way down the hallway, her hand following the pattern of the wallpaper for the purpose of keeping stability. She was doing this because she was trying to keep her balance. For the very first time in her life, she turned around and went into the restroom, which was a room that she had been to a great number of times all during her existence. Without a shadow of a doubt, she never wavered from her decision. When compared to the previous instance, however, this time around, different circumstances prevailed. The moment her foot made contact with the cool tile floor, it slipped out from beneath her and she fell to the ground. The occurrence took place precisely at that precise instant. There was no opportunity to take advantage of anything that was accessible at this time, and it was not possible to provide a response at this moment in time. As she was falling, the sharp corner of the toilet counter made a forceful contact with the side of her leg, which caused her to sustain major injuries. A major injury was sustained by her as a result of this act. As a consequence of this, she began to fall more and further into the depression. The guy experienced pain that was both instantaneous and terrible right away. Even though she let out a scream, the sound was muffled by the walls of her house, which were completely barren of any residents. Despite this, she was able to hear the sound. It was nearly impossible for anyone to pick up on her voice. Only when she looked down did she notice that a lengthy cut on her leg was beginning to flow the first few droplets of blood. She was surprised to find out that the cut was bleeding. Following a little amount of time, the first sensations of shock and pain were rapidly replaced by a cold surge of anxiety brought on by the unknown. Indeed, this was the conclusion. It was the same situation that she had always been concerned about, the one that her family had cautioned her about when she was younger, and it was the same situation that she was now confronted with. When she was by herself and there was no one to assist her, she took a significant amount of harm and suffered a great deal of pain. However, she was also hurt. Despite the fact that she had always insisted on living by herself, she had never really given much thought to what she would do in the case of a significant emergency. She had never really given much thought to what she would do either. What she would do was something that she had never really given much thought to before. As far as she was concerned, her primary purpose was to protect herself from getting wounded as much as possible. She was attempting to avoid getting wounded in any way. On the other hand, this method had not shown any signs of producing any noticeable results. The fortunate circumstance for June was that she did not completely lack a safety net. This was a fortunate circumstance for her. In the aftermath of the passing of her husband, her granddaughter insisted on having a network of emergency call bells put in every room of the house. One of her goals was to have this particular action carried out. The majority of the time, these were straightforward electrical gadgets that comprised of a cord that was suspended from the ceiling. It would immediately send a notification to the phone that belonged to her granddaughter whenever the line was withdrawn as soon as it was pulled. In addition to that, it would get in touch with the emergency services in the area. The bells were discovered in the restroom of the building, which was one of the locations included in the investigation. June was attempting to ignore the throbbing pain in her leg while she was lying on the floor. She reached up and clutched for the ceiling as she attempted to concentrate on the agony. With a sense of relief, she pulled on the thread with all of her effort when she had discovered it by her hand. She was relieved to have found the thread. There was a 10-minute stretch of time that separated the two periods. After what seemed like an eternity, time seemed to continue to pass. While June remained on the floor of the restroom, she was using a hand towel to apply pressure to the incision on her leg. She was doing this in an effort to slow down the rate at which she was bleeding. That same instant, she was finally able to hear the sound that she had been eagerly anticipating. The front door of her house opened. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Only a few moments later, she became aware of her granddaughter's voice, which was filled with concern as she called her name. She was concerned about her grandchild. Concerned about her grandchild, she did not feel well. June made an effort to call her back and let her know where she was located, but her voice was a little muffled. At the same time, she let her know where she was. In the span of a fraction of a second, her granddaughter materialized in the vicinity of the entranceway to the restroom. In addition to this, June's senior dog was following her around and walking directly behind her, pushing past her legs as she went about her regular chores. During the time that June was lying on the ground, both of them were able to see the blood that was on her face as well as the expression of misery that was on her face. It would have been impossible to ignore the worry that her granddaughter was expressing with her words. At the time that she was given the warning, she could not have possibly thought that the cut would be as severe as it actually was. On the other hand, June experienced a profound sense of comfort when she saw her granddaughter standing there, and when she saw her dog coming over to her with its tail wagging nervously. Both of these sensations brought her a sense of relief. Her attention was drawn back to the here and now by both of these occurrences. No matter how severe the cut was, it was of no consequence, whatever the severity of the cut was. It was possible to obtain assistance. At first, it appeared as though everything was going to be well on its own. Almost immediately, her dog came up to her and began gently exploring her palm while murmuring in a low voice. It was as if it had detected that something was very wrong with her. At first glance, it appeared as though it had found out that something was definitely not right. June started to feel a little bit more at ease while her granddaughter was frantically searching through the cupboards in the bathroom for bandages and disinfectant. This occurred when June's granddaughter was seeking for these items. During the time that she was stretching out with a hand that was shaking, she began to pat her dog, who was obviously quite concerned about her. The connection that they had remained just as strong as it had been in the past, despite the fact that a considerable period of time had elapsed since they had first met. The dog's presence on the premises brought a significant degree of comfort to the individuals who were there. After a certain amount of time had passed, her granddaughter was able to successfully locate a first aid kit and eventually found her way back to the house. Bandages were placed over the wound in a secure manner with the purpose of protecting it after the wound had been thoroughly cleaned to the best of her ability during the process. By the time the paramedics arrived a few minutes later, June's mental state had greatly improved, and the most of the bleeding had stopped by that point. June's condition had also significantly improved on its own. June's condition was also showing significant signs of improvement at the same time for her. There was no doubt that the soreness in her leg continued to exist, but the presence of her granddaughter and her dog had brought about a significant change in the conditions. When the paramedics entered the crowded restroom, they brought their equipment with them, which resulted in the space becoming more crowded than it had been before. When they were squatting down to evaluate her injury, they did so in a manner that was both professional and empathetic. This was the case throughout the entire process. They began by carefully removing the improvised bandage that her granddaughter had applied to the region before proceeding to remove it for good. They did this in order to get a better look at the wound that was causing them discomfort. A reassuring smile formed on the face of one of them as they looked up at June while they were in the process of finishing the thorough cleaning. As a result of the facts that he revealed with her, she was given the impression that it was significantly more dreadful than it actually was. It was a reduction that, when everything was taken into consideration, was not quite that big. The assertion that he made was that she would not even require stitches under any circumstances. They suggested that she keep it clean and possibly have her granddaughter stay for a limited period of time in order to reduce the likelihood of her falling again. The purpose of this was to prevent her from falling again in the future. On the other hand, the medical professionals stated that she was in perfect, healthy condition. They did not display any signs that there was a cause for concern. When the paramedics were in the process of gathering their belongings and leaving the premises that they were in, June expressed her gratitude to them after they had completed their duties. It was a little time in which she, her granddaughter, and the dog were all sitting together on the floor of the restroom, and during that brief moment, there was an emotion of collective thankfulness that permeated the ambiance. They were under the impression that they had been able to avoid being struck by a gunshot. There is a possibility that the fall had a lot more devastating consequences than what was initially thought. Not just a shattered hip, but also a brain injury that was acquired throughout the incident. When I was just left with a small cut on my leg, it felt like a fortunate escape from the situation that I was previously in. When June awoke the following morning in her bed, she was immediately aware that something was wrong. August, on the other hand, was not conscious of anything at all. Her boyfriend had been the one she had been sleeping with. Despite the fact that she was merely lying there, she felt sick to her stomach since her heart was beating so hard against her ribs the entire time. In spite of the fact that she had not even sat up yet, she was experiencing nausea and vomiting. She was experiencing emotions of lightheadedness and dizziness, and she also got the impression that the room was softly spinning. She was also experiencing a feeling of lightheadedness. She was completely covered in a layer of sweat that was everywhere on her body. This was in no way typical in any way, shape, or form. A horrific experience for everyone involved was the fact that this had never happened before in the history of the world. Her granddaughter had remained at the spot for a few hours after the paramedics had left the previous day, after they had left the scene. During the time that they were having their conversation, they performed a number of things, including drinking tea, making sure that June was comfortable, and making sure that everything she required was within easy reach. Despite June's assurance that she was in good condition, her granddaughter eventually left, promising to call with an update in the morning. June told her granddaughter that she was all right. The granddaughter of June had assured her that she would call with one. June had experienced some discomfort in the area surrounding the cut on her leg that evening, which was to be expected. However, it did not appear to be a significant illness. June's leg had been cut. A cut had been made in June's leg. As she began to drift off to sleep, she was left with the impression that she had been extremely fortunate throughout the course of the day. However, at this point, which was probably 12 hours later, something was going on inside her body that was extremely, extremely wrong. This was the case. June was unable to determine with absolute certainty whether or not the cut that was on her thigh was connected to the new and concerning symptoms that she was experiencing. June was having these symptoms. As far as I can tell, this is the situation. As far as the paramedics are concerned, the event was not a particularly serious one. On the other hand, the severity of what she was going through, in conjunction with the sensation that her body was moving in the wrong direction, caused her to make the decision that she would absolutely not take any chances. Within the context of this particular situation, she did not pull the emergency cord that was available to her. She extended her hand to the phone that was put on the table next to her bed and dialed the number for an ambulance in order to have her transported to the hospital. She intended for the ambulance to take her to the hospital. The medical staff immediately became aware of her situation the moment she arrived at the emergency room, and they immediately began carrying out a battery of examinations as soon as they were aware of her condition. Her temperature was taken and blood was drawn from her as part of the comprehensive assessment of her vital signs that was carried out. After they had finally figured out what was going on, they were able to discover what was going on in a reasonably short amount of time. Upon completion of the examinations, it was found that she was suffering from a severe bacterial disease. The conclusion that was arrived at was found to be this. Upon further investigation, the medical professionals arrived at the conclusion that the open cut on her leg served as the point of entry for the bacteria that had invaded her body. Upon conducting their examination of her, they came to this ultimate conclusion. The fact that the sickness had already made its way into her system was an aspect of the circumstance that was much more distressing. It was because of this that she was experiencing feelings of lightheadedness and perspiration, and it also provided an explanation to the question of why her heart was racing so quickly. The emergency medical condition is known as sepsis, and it is a condition that poses a considerable risk to the individual who is being treated. The medical team was taken aback as a result of this, given the circumstances. They had a number of inquiries that would be considered to be of great significance. It is inconceivable that a cut that appeared to be very minor could have resulted in the development of such a severe sickness in such a short amount of time. The report that was submitted by the paramedics indicated that they had cleaned the wound in a proper manner prior to departing from the scene. There was not a single item that made any type of sense. On the other hand, at this particular moment in time, they were not directly concerned with locating an answer to the question of how it had occurred. All of their concentration was focused on making an effort to preserve June's life. Nobody else was paying attention to anything else. An emergency course of therapy was devised for her, which included the administration of potent antibiotics that were effective against a wide range of infections. When it comes to treating with an infection that is known to be unknown, this is the normal process that is followed. As a result of the fact that these antibiotics are of a more generic character, it is predicted that they will be successful in treating the bacteria that are responsible for the issue. June, on the other hand, was not receiving any kind of aid from it in any sense of the word. Her health did not improve, despite the fact that she exerted a great deal of effort. It was beyond reasonable doubt that the situation was deteriorating, and it was deteriorating at a rapid pace. At that point in time, June had already reached the age of 83, and her health was already in a position that was deemed to be relatively poor. Her physical being simply did not possess the reserves that were necessary to protect itself against such a tremendous onslaught. It was simply not feasible for her to have those reserves. The quick deterioration of her condition that was taking place was something that they witnessed right in front of their very eyes. All of the medical personnel were well aware that they were competing against the clock in order to complete their tasks. An ineffectiveness was identified with the antibiotics that were considered to be fundamental. In order for them to have any chance of surviving, it was vital for them to determine the specific type of bacteria that was responsible for this sickness. Only then could they have any hope of saving themselves. If they were able to identify the treatment, they might be able to use a treatment that is better targeted to the specific condition. As an illustration, they could be able to make use of an antibiotic that has been developed with the express purpose of eliminating that particular intruder. In order to isolate and identify the microscopic foe that was responsible for her death, they started doing further tests, one of which was the culture of her blood. This was done in an effort to solve the mystery of what caused her death. It was of the utmost importance that they obtain responses, and they anticipated receiving them as quickly as possible. When June's granddaughter arrived at the hospital, she was greeted by a doctor who then proceeded to have a conversation with her. June's granddaughter had rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. Her granddaughter June had hurriedly made her way to the hospital. In addition to requesting that she walk him through the events that had taken place the day before, beginning with the moment she arrived at the house, he also demanded that she guide him through each step of the process. Every single thing was crucial to him, regardless of how minor or unimportant it might appear to be. He was meticulous in his attention to detail. His attention to detail was impeccable in every single respect. He inquired about the fall, the wound, and the method in which she wrapped it. He asked these questions in order to have more information. In spite of the fact that her voice was quivering with nervousness during the entirety of the story, the granddaughter continued to relate the tale. The manner in which she discovered her grandma laying on the ground, the manner in which she sought for the first aid kit, and the manner in which the paramedics arrived at the scene were all meticulously described in her narrative. While the physician was attentively listening, he nodded his head in agreement with what was being said. An inquiry was made by him. He made an inquiry. He inquired, "Was there anything else?" he asked. The granddaughter pondered for a little period of time. "Has there been anything at all that occurred in the restroom while you were searching for bandages?" From that very moment on, her thoughts were a jumbled mixture of panic and confusion. She was worried about anything that had occurred in the restroom, and she was anxious about it. Following that, however, a picture was presented to the viewer. She murmured in a quiet voice, "Her dog," saying it. "That's her dog. I brought her dog with me. He was in there with us." The doctor's approach remained the same. However, he leaned in somewhat closer to the patient who was present. "That's her dog." He made the request, "Tell me about the dog," and I said that I would comply with his request. "I brought her dog with me. What was the dog doing?" As the granddaughter reflected on the series of occurrences that had taken place, she began to experience tears welling up in her eyes. She made it clear that he was merely attempting to alleviate the suffering that she was going through at the time. A look of rising terror appeared on her face as she hesitated and said June was on the floor petting him. He was licking her hand and, oh God, he was licking her leg. He was licking the cut. I didn't think anything of it. I thought he was just trying to clean it, to make her feel better. The doctor thanked her and instructed her to wait to return to the laboratory. After that, he hurriedly went back to the laboratory in order to proceed with his journey before continuing on. In spite of the fact that his suspicion was a disastrous one, he was able to develop it. There was a point in time when the findings from the laboratory were brought back to the laboratory. After everything was said and done, the tests were successful in identifying the bacteria that should be eliminated. However, by the time they were able to determine the name, it was already too late for any treatment that was specifically targeted to make a difference in the circumstance where they found themselves. Her immune system was completely weakened by the virus, and it took complete control of her body. As June was suffering from acute sepsis, a condition that offers a significant threat to her chances of survival, she was in a terrible danger of not surviving. When the body's response to an infection becomes so intense that it begins to cause harm to the body's own tissues and important organs, the signs of this condition become apparent. This disorder is characterized by a dysfunction in the immune system. Because her body was making a frantic effort to defend itself against the invasion, her body was, in effect, shutting himself down. This was because her body was trying to combat the invasion. The members of the medical staff were successful in doing everything that they were able to successfully complete. Despite their efforts to treat her with a variety of treatments and even put her on life support, the illness continued to progress without any interruptions. However, these precautions were not adequate to prevent the virus from spreading further. As a result of the illness that she had been afflicted with, June Baxter passed dead just 1 week after she was sent to the hospital for treatment. In the end, it would be revealed that the potentially harmful bacteria that had made its way into June's open wound had been administered to her in the most heinous and unexpected manner that could possibly be dreamt of. The situation would be like this. Additionally, the bacterium was referred to as Pasteurella multocida for the purpose of providing additional information. However, the bacterium in question is not the kind that is generally discovered on the floor of a lavatory or in the nook of a countertop. This is because the bacterium in question is not a mold. It is specifically located in the interior of the lips of domestic cats and dogs. Examples of these animals include cats and dogs. The location in question is really specific. During the time that June was waiting for her granddaughter to locate bandages, her cherished and elderly dog was behaving in the same manner that it had always done. This took place at the same time that June was making herself comfortable on the floor of the restroom. The purpose of this was to comfort her that there was nothing wrong with her. It was able to convey its feelings of compassion and concern for the people who were in its close area by utilizing the only means that were accessible to it. In addition, the dog had begun licking the wound that was exposed in front of her as a means of providing her with some degree of comfort for the time being. Irrespective of the fact that it was a gesture of affection toward a member of its pack who had been harmed, it was also an inclination to care for the individual in question. However, as a result of this action, the dog had unwittingly delivered the germs that caused Pasteurella multicida into June's bloodstream. This illness was caused by the bacteria that caused the disease. The dog's saliva included these microorganisms which were discovered. The wound had been cleaned by the paramedics when they arrived. Nevertheless, by the time they had finished, the germs had already started to spread throughout the body. It became impossible to maintain control over the situation, and it started to grow at a breakneck speed. In spite of the fact that the individual had been younger and in better health, it is still feasible that the immune system would have been able to prevent the illness from happening. On the other hand, there was a sentence of death for a woman who was 83 years old and experienced significant health issues prior to the sentence being handed down. Her execution was carried out. The aftermath of the catastrophe was, unfortunately, a very unpleasant one due to the circumstances. To put it another way, there was no offense that required legal action to be taken, and there was no one who was to blame for the situation. An extremely peculiar accident occurred as a result of a fleeting time of feelings of devotion. The accident was caused by a brief moment of devotion. In light of the events that transpired, June's granddaughter was left with a significant amount of humiliation that she had to carry with her. She had to come to grips with the fact that she had unknowingly set in motion the series of events that ultimately led to her grandmother's dying by bringing the dog that she thought would provide her grandmother with peace. She had brought the puppy to her grandmother in the mistaken belief that it would provide her with comfort. She was forced to confront the reality that she was the one who was responsible for the passing of her grandma. The dog that June had loved so much, the one that served as a live link to her late husband and happier times, was the unknowing instrument that had led to her passing away earlier than she had intended. June had loved the puppy so much that it served as a living link to her husband and happier times. The dog had been of great affection to June. The painful irony that exists is one that, when everything is taken into consideration, is nearly impossible to fathom. It was a simple fall, a small cut, and an act of love from a devoted pet that all came together in the most terrible way possible, resulting in the death of a woman who had only wanted to spend her final years in the quiet and freedom of her own home. The woman's death was the result of all of these little things coming together. Friends and family of the deceased woman suffered a terrible loss when she passed away. To begin, I would like to convey my appreciation for your presence in this room today. In the event that you watch the program that was broadcast tonight, I would be grateful if you could please share your thoughts with me in the comment section. It is also important to keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime available for you to view all at once right now. Within a single sitting, you are able to watch all of these episodes, at least until the next time we get together. How are things going?